Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1381, Another Heavenly Fragment. If Zen had only relied on the magnetic sacred mountain, Nathan probably wouldn't have been at a disadvantage. But Zen cultivated the G-clan's secret technique. Nathan got a stifling feeling in his heart. First of all, he didn't specialize in strength. And in terms of speed, he wasn't that much faster than Zen. His strong point was the power in his spear arts. Now, this strength was completely restricted by his opponent. After Zen broke through the first purple spear shadow, his figure turned and headed straight for the second purple spear shadow, then the third. After successfully shattering the 3 spear shadows, he lingered for a moment before dashing at Nathan again. In his hand, he grasped the sword that glowed with golden light, while his other hand held onto the crystal shield formed by the cyan light. Since the magnetic power easily broke through Nathan's spear strike, Zen no longer needed to escape. It was Nathan who had to find a way out of it. Die. As Zen charged at him, Nathan ruthlessly thrust his spear. Purple spear light bloomed like flowers as the strong law power flowed unceasingly. Such was the power of truth, the foundation of all laws. But at this point, Nathan didn't have the ability to construct the laws himself. Still, destroying the laws was much easier than constructing them. Nathan had a chance. But this spear strike that was supposed to be able to break through all laws now seemed hollow and powerless in front of Nathan's opponent. Zen blocked it easily. It's my turn now. Behind the crystal shield, Zen wore a faint smile on his face. The broken sword was like a bolt of lightning as it shot toward Nathan. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. From the top to the bottom of the mountain, Zen unleashed 4 sword strikes in a row. Though Nathan managed to figure out the flaws of the 2 sword strikes, the third sword pierced Nathan's chest, leaving a foot-long wound. It was deep enough to expose his bone. And the 4th slash pierced right through his chest. Scarlet blood splattered the heaven-earth board in a line. Covered in wounds, Nathan finally staggered away from Zen as he stood in a corner of the board. Clad in a brocade robe, Nathan looked somewhat pitiful. His left shoulder was broken with the bone exposed and the wound in his chest wouldn't stop bleeding. He no longer looked like a handsome man. You can admit defeat, Zen stated indifferently. The double-colored sword beam condensed above the broken sword once again, hovering over the sword. Nathan's expression turned sad at Zen's words. His eyes were filled with resistance as his body trembled. No one had expected Nathan's loss. It's finally over. Zen won the first place in the end. Nathan's been suppressed to such an extent that he doesn't even have the strength to fight back. I think he's even inferior to Rocher. The odds are against him having to go against Rocher for second place. The crowd started to clamor. It seemed that the outcome of the battle had been decided. Now, the Xuanyuan clan remained silent. Supreme Lord of Original Sin was wrapped in a thick robe, an impenetrable black mist appearing before his eyes, hiding his expression. Nathan's defeat is a good thing, he explained in a low voice. There seemed to be some kind of special magic in his tone, something filled with unparalleled majesty. Anyone who heard it would have to submit to it. According to the fate displayed by the Heaven-Earth Board, first place belongs to him. None of the variables should affect him. But a man without destiny has appeared, and that is none other than Zen. He seems to be the biggest variable now, someone besides Supreme Lord of Original Sin sighed. Fate isn't something that can be decided in the first place. No one can predict the future. As Supreme Lord of Original Sin spoke, he saw Nathan drop the spear in his hand. When he stretched out his hands, a small fragment appeared before his chest. Above the fragment was a ball of Nathan's blood essence. Heavenly fragment. When it came into his view, Zen looked at it strangely. So Nathan also possesses a heavenly fragment, he thought. Previously, Zen had obtained one at the bottom of the Tower of Sin, but he didn't know how to use it correctly. According to what Lavender said, each heavenly fragment was different according to the rules recorded within. If he wanted to stimulate the power of the fragment, he probably needed a Supreme Lord's help. Zen had yet to figure out what the true purpose of his heavenly fragment was. At this moment, he had no intention of stopping Nathan, he wanted to see how the latter would use it. Though Zen didn't stop him, someone else stopping him couldn't be avoided. "Nathan, stop," Supreme Lord of Original Sin suddenly roared when he witnessed the scene. And this roar seemed 10 times louder than the one triggered by the roaring token. All the hidden beasts in the universe began stirring. Many of them were awakened by the thundering sound. Countless martial artists instinctively covered their ears. The sound broke through even the boundaries of the illusion battlefield, reaching into the picture scroll, reverberating unceasingly through the world inside the scroll. "Nathan, stop, stop, stop." The sound seemed to come from very far away. Once it was transmitted into the painting, it grew faint. The voice made Nathan's hands tremble slightly, and he could barely hold onto the fragment as it tumbled onto the board. The ball of blood essence wrapped around the fragment fell as well, splattering a flower of blood onto the board. At this point, Nathan was reeling from the shock of hearing the sound, conflicted. He wasn't willing to lose to Zen like this. The world of chaos would indeed bring a great disaster, but it would also bring an unimaginable fortune. And only he could be the center of this good fortune, no one else. His confidence was built on this sort of mindset. He believed that he was the #1 warrior in the entire universe. But when he faced Zen, a warrior he couldn't defeat, his confidence wavered wildly. To protect his very state of mind, he had to use the heavenly fragment. It was his sole chance of winning. But Supreme Lord of Original Sin's roar came as a shock, snapping him back into reality. Pulling out the heavenly fragment there was already considered taboo. Was he still willing to use it? Determination grew in his eyes. So long as he used the fragment, Zen didn't stand a chance. Supreme Lord of Original Sin, the patriarch of the Xuanyuan clan, had poured so much effort into merging the fragment with Nathan because the heavenly fragment involved the Xuanyuan clan's future plans. If the heavenly fragment was used there, the clan's future plans would be exposed to the universe. It was simply too great of a risk for the clan. "Nathan, don't use it." The next moment, the patriarch's voice resounded once again, somehow both dignified and pleading. Nathan looked pained and conflicted. The tangled emotions in his heart were almost clearly visible. Chapter 1382, A Godly Plate. The patriarch of the Xuanyuan clan placed this heavenly fragment in Nathan's body for his own, personal purpose. If Nathan used it now, then he would ruin everything. The young man slowly came to. His anger gradually dissipated as he slowly calmed himself down. Losing this battle wasn't the end of his life. As the saying went, lack of forbearance in small matters upsets great plans. His future remained bright. Nathan held the heavenly fragment in his hand. By the time he stretched it out, the fragment had already disappeared. "I admit defeat," he said through clenched teeth. This was the very first time these words had ever been uttered by Nathan's lips. He was someone who never admitted defeat. In fact, you could say that he was born as a winner. Nathan was born with the destiny of being this grand era's main character. If everything went according to the fate, then he would have been the one who won first place in the illusion battlefield. However, Zen had become the biggest variable in changing his fate. Zen smiled, obviously pleased with his victory. In a flash, he flew in the air and threw the broken sword towards Lone. A white light flashed and his body disappeared from the stone. 9 people remained in the picture scroll. These 9 would still have to fight to decide their rankings. Roche and Nathan still had to fight for second place. Shania and Kurt were also set to battle, along with Lucille and Lawson. However, their battles had nothing to do with Zen, who was now the ultimate victor of the illusion battlefield. "Hey!" Margaret shouted in fury the moment Zen vanished. Why did he disappear so quickly? Zen had no time to face her anger. Right now, he traversed through a patch of white clouds so thick, it almost blocked his sight completely. Ever since entering the illusion battlefield, he had always wondered what kind of place it exactly was. It covered 50 supreme worlds created by the heavens. Could it be a battlefield within the heavens? Or was it just an illusion? A huge shadow streaked across the clouds, then the second, and then the third. "What's that?" Zen murmured. The shadow streaks appeared here and there before finally appearing in Zen's line of sight. The shadows turned out to be many massive mountains identical in size, shape, and appearance. On top of each mountain were many round, stone pillars very similar to the Hall of Causality Zen had seen before. "You can take one of the godly plates first," the mysterious girl said in Zen's ear. This girl's voice was usually very cold, as if she was a mere disembodied statue. However, she was extremely pleasant and casual when she talked to Zen. "A godly plate?" he asked. Upon approaching a mountain, he discovered a milky white disk floating along the enormous stone pillars. Was this what he had fought for? Zen's eyes flickered. If one could hold a godly tile on a godly plate, then why couldn't those supreme lords obtain one? He arrived just in front of the disc. He looked at it carefully and couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, "Eh." The godly plate didn't really look so godly. In fact, it looked like an ordinary plate made of some unknown material. However, Zen could feel that it held an extremely stable power. What was the most peculiar though was that the thing formed by Zen's chaotic energy in his chaotic sea during his fight with Rocher was almost exactly the same as this godly plate. It was very strange. Could it be that his chaotic energy temporarily became a godly plate? Or perhaps, that cross-shaped crystal in his inner world was actually a godly tile? Just as he thought about this, the mysterious girl's voice spoke in his ear. "What are you standing there for? You can take it." Her words of affirmation were enough for Zen. He reached out and gently touched the disc. As he did, it began to rotate slowly, getting smaller and smaller. Once it reached the size of a thumb, it stopped and zoomed into Zen's belly. Using his inner vision, Zen watched as the godly plate floated within his inner world. Now a world tree and a godly plate were inside his inner world. "Congratulations Zen, you won first place. Do you have any more questions to ask me?" "I'll make an exception and let you ask 3 questions, the mysterious girl said. Zen already knew what he wanted to ask. "Is there any news about Yan?" The girl was silent for a while. He had already asked this question 100 times, perhaps more, over the years. "Can you ask another question?" she replied, obviously tired of hearing this same old question from him. Zen shrugged. It was the thing that concerned him the most and yet she refused to answer. "What is your name? Who exactly are you?" The mysterious girl was once again silent. It was obvious that she was hesitating whether or not she should answer. "My name is Irene Zhang. What's your next question?" "Irene, do you have any news about Yan?" he asked again. "What the heck?" Irene Zhang cursed in her head. Why must he always ask that question? He's a great storyteller but he is actually so boring. She was extremely conflicted at that moment and could do nothing but remain silent. However, her silence ignited a sliver of hope in Zen's heart. "You must know where she is." "According to the agreement, I am entitled to know," Zen insisted. Irene Zhang sighed. "I don't think it's a good idea to tell you the truth." She didn't think that finding Yan was going to be a difficult task at first. However, that was before she found out just what exactly that young woman managed to get herself into. To make it short, Yan was in the hands of a bunch of madmen. Getting Zen involved with them was certainly not going to be a good thing. Still, Zen remained stubborn. "I must know. I can tell you that she is indeed in the divine land, but that's it. No more," Irene Zhang said firmly. Zen smiled at her words. "Thank you." He had never met this woman before. The only communication he had with her was through the roaring token whenever he told her stories. The information she provided him was far from enough. How was Yan doing? Which part of the divine land was she in? These were the things he needed to know. However, just knowing she was in the divine land was enough for now. That place was still unreachable for Zen. He would need to step over the heavens if he wanted to go there. Despite getting the first place in the illusion battlefield, he knew that this oncoming task was still going to be a bit challenging for him. Luckily, he was set to receive another reward. Zen, along with the second and third place winners, would receive an extremely useful gift, the modification of their fates. In other words, Zen's luck was about to be changed. Enhancing his luck was going to be extremely useful to Zen, especially during times when he would need to rely on probabilities. He had always been quite lucky, especially when he had devoured those luck-devouring snakes. However, the peak of his luck only lasted for a short period of time. He hadn't seized the opportunity at that time. Practicing the stellar body when his luck reached its limit would be an easier task. His current luck wasn't as good as when he consumed those luck-devouring snakes. Changing one's luck was no easy task. It must be an ability that only the heavens possessed, right? This Irene Zhang seemed to be the one in charge of the heavens. Unfortunately, Zen didn't really know who she was or what role she played exactly. She wasn't someone who could casually interfere with how the heavens did things. With his questions done, Zen waited on top of the mountain for the arrival of the next warrior. It was quite a while before another person emerged from the white mist. The man was tall and had a heroic expression on his face. It was none other than Rocher. The first to win would be the first to enter the clouds and take a godly plate. Since Rocher was the second, then that could only mean that he managed to defeat Nathan. Sure enough, Nathan came walking after Rocher. His expression was extremely foul since he only got third place. Shania ranked 4th while Kurt ranked 5th. As for Margaret, she managed to get 10th place. If the ranking had been based purely on strength, she would have ranked higher. However, after entering the top 10, she decided to just concede all the way, hence her low ranking. She gazed up at the mountains and wanted to fly towards Zen. However, she couldn't get close. All Margaret could do was give up and cry in bitter regret. I should have told him to meet in the purple power world, she thought to herself. Chapter 1383, Surprise. The illusion battlefield competition was finally over. The pictures that had appeared in the universe began to close and disappear gradually. When Zen opened his eyes again, he was in a trance. He felt as if he didn't belong to this world. The competition in the illusion battlefield had lasted less than 3 months, but during this period of time, many battles had occurred. Each battle was like a round of tempering, and it gave warriors new insights into strategies and skills. At this very moment, the entire universe was changing. The first of the many changes was the universe spirit tablet. When some talents passed through the hall of causality, they chose to duplicate the supreme divine weapon in their hands. As a result, the rankings on the spirit tablet changed drastically. Originally, there were only 3,000 supreme divine weapons, but now suddenly over 1,000 more weapons were appearing. Clearly, all of these supreme divine weapons had been duplicated through the hall of causality. When the ray of light disappeared from Zen's body, 3 colored dots of light suddenly appeared around him. These dots of light were like countless elves as they flew into Zen's body. After Zen had absorbed these specks of light, his original aura intensified to a great degree. This was the reward from the second stage of the illusion battlefield. He's back. A slim figure ambled out from the inner courtyard. The person who was wearing a smile on her face was no other than Freya. After the end of the first stage, she had left the illusion battlefield and waited for a long time. Zen acknowledged her presence with a warm smile. He then turned his head in another direction and asked, "Why do you like to always hide?" At the sound of his voice, Lavender's slender frame floated into view from the other side. She was Zen's sword spirit, so naturally he could sense where she was. Lavender seemed to be different now from what she was a few months ago. Right now she looked morose and dejected, which was an alien expression on her face. She had been an extremely powerful woman, but now she was depressed. Even so, this miserable expression also made her seem enchanting. Some people might even be attracted to her at the first sight. "What's your ranking?" Lavender asked bluntly. Freya was also concerned about this, so she looked towards Zen with curiosity. Since Zen had just returned, he must have entered the second stage. Freya could not see the picture of the illusion battlefield, but she only knew that there were 2 stages there. Besides, she had no idea that there was a bigger competition on the Heaven-Earth board. "Guess," Zen asked mirthfully. Freya blinked her eyes. "You must have scored a rank in the top 10,000. Freya had entered the illusion battlefield and also witnessed all the powerful warriors in the universe. Just like those outstanding warriors, she, too, was at the Soul Sea realm, but there was a huge gap between them. Any one of those powerful warriors in the main city could fight against the Spirit Supreme Realm warriors, and yet this kind of warrior could not be considered truly powerful in the illusion battlefield. The one who scored a place among the top 10,000 warriors was extremely remarkable in Freya's eyes. Zen wore a big smile on his face as he said, "You're right." "Well, what on earth is your ranking?" Lavender asked again. Zen was confused with the change in Lavender's attitude. It had only been a few months since he saw her, but her temperament seemed to have changed a lot. He replied, "I have won the first place." "The first place? Zen, you. Freya was extremely astonished. Freya considered Zen to be a powerful warrior, but the fact that he would even be able to obtain the first place among all the Soul Sea realm martial artists was far beyond her imagination. A faint smile appeared on Lavender's face. She was very satisfied with Zen's answer, and gradually relief crept into her heart. She wanted to congratulate him, but no words came out. However, to her surprise, Zen's figure suddenly flashed and appeared in front of her. Both their faces were extremely close. Zen looked serious as he stared intently at Lavender. "You don't seem to be in a good mood." He had felt that there was something wrong with Lavender from the moment he laid eyes on her. Lavender was a sword spirit, so she could not be ill, but she looked so weak and dispirited, which bothered Zen. Being conscious of the proximity of Zen's face to her, Lavender couldn't help but step back and shake her head. "It's nothing." However, Zen revealed a mysterious smile. "Oh right, I have a gift for you." A gift? Lavender was slightly surprised, but she thought to herself that the illusion battlefield was just a world of illusion, so what could Zen bring out of it? Naturally, she did not know that many warriors in the universe were paying close attention to the changes on the spirit tablet and the rankings of the supreme divine weapons. After the competition of the illusion battlefield, the number of supreme divine weapons had increased to over 4,000, but many first-rank divine weapons had been removed from the spirit tablet. Zen gently tapped his space ring and 2 beams of light spilled out. Seeing the 2 beams of cold light, Lavender frowned. When the 2 tips of the spear were thrust out, her jaw dropped. Saint Spear, you. Zen said he wanted to give her a gift, but Lavender would never have expected that he would actually give her the saint-killing spear. After the initial shock subsided, she racked her brains trying to figure out from where Zen got the saint-killing spear. This saint-killing spear had been snatched away from her by Elena earlier. Could he have made a trip to the Demon Knight, and grabbed the saint-killing spear right under Elena's nose? It was impossible. When Lavender took the saint-killing spear from Zen's hand, the spear suddenly began to ring. When Zen had acquired the saint-killing spear, he couldn't trigger it and make it ring. After all, Lavender was its rightful owner. Whoosh! Lavender shook it slightly and an enormous spear shadow formed. Shadowy spin. This shadow was 10 times more powerful than it was when Zen unleashed it. Holding on to the saint spear, Lavender's spirits were lifted. She turned her head and asked in surprise, "How did you do it?" Zen understood Lavender's confusion, so he gave a brief summary of the story. This spear was naturally obtained from Malachi. He also spoke about Haley as well as the situation of the Saint Spear sect. Hearing this, Lavender's face became gloomy. She didn't expect the Saint Spear sect episode to be so terrible. So in other words, you're telling me that this spear is actually a duplicate? Lavender exclaimed. Zen nodded. Shoo! A spear shadow was released by Lavender. Wisps of killing intent were emitting from Lavender's body. I will surely make Elena pay the price for all evil things she has done. Zen nodded. Give me some time. I believe it won't take long. Looking at Lavender's murderous but perfect face, Zen knew that the old Lavender was back. Unfortunately, this state did not last for very long. Not long after, Lavender had gone back to her sulking and floated silently behind Zen, maintaining a certain distance from him. Zen was perplexed once more, but he couldn't ask her what happened directly. After returning, he began to communicate with the Cyan Dragon in his mind, talking about all sorts of things he had seen and experienced in the illusion battlefield, as well as seeking answers to many doubts. What's wrong with Lavender? After talking with the Cyan Dragon for a short while, Zen brought up Lavender. He couldn't figure out what had happened during his long absence from the fairy palace. Although the Cyan Dragon was concealed within Zen's body, he could not communicate with Zen after he entered the illusion battlefield. During this period of time, he could only rest within Zen's mind. However, the Cyan Dragon could naturally observe everything outside of Zen's body. Hearing Zen's question, the Cyan Dragon chuckled but didn't answer. This further aggravated Zen's puzzlement. During this trip to the illusion battlefield, countless warriors of the Soul Sea realm had accumulated their cultivation base after going through so many life and death experiences and used it to break through their bottlenecks. Countless Soul Sea realm warriors had chosen to cultivate in seclusion at this moment. Zen was no exception. In just a few days, a lot of big heavenly tribulations had appeared in countless supreme worlds. About 30% of the warriors of the Soul Sea realm had reached the Spirit Supreme realm. This kind of occurrence could not have happened in the past. Zen spent a total of 13 days being engrossed in closed-door cultivation. Several world lords from the Demon Knight and the Ogre race maintained their distance, guarding the fairy palace. 13 days later, a giant tribulation cloud formed above them quietly. A world lord stared at the tribulation cloud, his eyes revealing a look of shock. "This is the Grand Meteorite Tribulation," he gasped. "It seems that Zen has broken through. It might be. It's time for us to leave as well." Since Zen had already achieved first place in the illusion battlefield, he was destined to be the #1 character in the world of chaos. His fate was linked to the rise and fall of the universe. Every race would hold out an olive branch to him. Thus it was meaningless for these world lords to guard Fairy Palace. Chapter 1384. The Birth of a New World. There was a knowing look in Zen's eyes. The big heavenly tribulation this time was also a test for his skills. First came the Grand Meteorite Tribulation, then the Raging Fire Tribulation, then the Inner Demon Tribulation. After a series of tribulations, the Thunder Tribulation finally dawned on him. Zen was no stranger to the Thunder Tribulation, as the Thunderbolt Annihilation he practiced could trigger it directly. However, there was something special about this Thunder Tribulation. It had a green bolt of lightning. The Thunder Tribulation struck his abdomen and fell into his internal world. Therefore, Zen couldn't avoid or touch it. The moment the thunder tribulation made contact with his elixir field, a searing pain racked his whole body. Then, the world tree absorbed most of the thunder tribulation. Therefore, the world tree began to grow under the thunder tribulation's baptism as the waters of the chaotic sea rolled violently at the same time, and formed a stormy sea in Zen's body. At that moment, his soul also underwent a strange change. It felt like he had fallen into the deepest pits of chaos. Everything around him was gray and hazy. His body rolled listlessly as he fell even further into the chaos. After an unknown period of time, the rolling finally slowed down. Zen suddenly felt like he was pushed on a patch of land. He opened his eyes, and was greeted by the shocking sight of the huge world tree. What was more, there appeared to be an island beneath it. Zen's eyes lit up in a flash. At the same time, the entire chaotic sea began to solidify. What used to be a seemingly endless ocean of chaotic energy in his internal world was now changed by the sudden appearance of this island. The island wasn't that big. Zen looked like he knew something, but couldn't quite place it. He had seen this type of place before, that was for sure. Back when he had entered Brianna's inner world, he had seen an island too. However, the island in her body was much larger than Zen's. Hers had many forests and dwarf shrubs growing on it. There was even a relatively primitive tribe. "I have already reached the Spirit Supreme Realm," Zen exclaimed. Although he was still in a dazed state, the scene before him made him realize that he had already broken through the Soul Sea realm and reached the Spirit Supreme Realm, which was why he had encountered that green thunder tribulation. That same thunder tribulation which was filled with life energy gave life to the entire chaotic sea. Zen stood there in silence as he witnessed the passing of time, the rudiments of the world, and the evolution of life. Splash! His eyes averted to the brown ocean, where its brown waters rolled in thick, foamy waves towards the island. He noticed that the island continued to expand when a part of the chaotic energy solidified, which happened with every wave that came. If one looked more closely at the sea, there were actually some plankton that were mixed in the waters. Some of the plankton were washed onto the brown-colored island and were drilled into the mud, which was also formed from chaotic energy. Soon enough, the ground began to turn green and was eventually covered with slippery moss. Only when the inner world had evolved to this point, did its speed slow down. Everything present, whether the plankton or the moss, was the most primitive form of life. It would take a lot of time to reproduce all sorts of creatures, even humans. Brianna had spent over 100,000 years and only managed to develop a tribe. How long would Zen's inner world take to create humans? On the other hand, there was endless chaos. Outside the divine land. Such a place was a forbidden zone, even to the true gods. Only a handful of truly powerful warriors were able to traverse through the deadly chaos. There had been some mighty warrior in the past who had traveled the chaos for 1,000,000,000 miles, but the depths of the chaos remained the same as before. In other words, no one knew where the chaos ended. At that moment, a small ball appeared in some area in the chaos. It was no ordinary ball as it rapidly expanded like a bubble. But it suddenly stopped when it had reached a certain point, and seemed to wait for the next expansion. Any warrior who were to see it would be utterly shocked. There was actually a world tree inside the bubble, and the bubble even formed a world of its own. Ever since the creating axe had split the heaven and earth, all of the worlds were built around the divine land. This meant that no one had ever been able to create a world in the chaos. The world that had been formed in the chaos was extremely small compared to the divine land, that it was almost insignificant. However, it was slowly expanding. No one knew how large it could grow. Then again, the chaos was so vast that its size was even unimaginable. It wouldn't be unusual if even the mighty warriors wouldn't be able to notice the tiny little world. Zen opened his eyes after he had observed the island in his belly for quite some time, a hint of joy on his face. His cultivation level had definitely improved a lot after he had entered the Spirit Supreme Realm. He then turned his gaze towards the lotus flower above his head. The lotus flower rotated slowly as its 35 petals glinted under the light. A thought seemed to have crossed his mind when he looked at the lotus flower. "It looks like I'll have to make a trip to the Sword Manor," he murmured. His lotus flower had yet to reach perfection, and it should have something to do with the emotion-closing godly way. Supreme Lord Sword had once told Zen that he still had a flaw that he had yet to comprehend, and this flaw was something he couldn't comprehend if he relied only on himself. That was why he needed to go to the Sword Manor. It was also why Supreme Lord Sword had put a sword rune in Zen's arm. Now, Zen had 3 places to go to. The first was the northern twilight star, because the secret left behind by Vivica, Elspeth, Salvador and Anisha was to be found there. The second was where the celestial position race lived. The world lords had blocked the fairy palace before the illusion battlefield had opened, so he hadn't been able to make it to the celestial position's location. Lastly, the third destination that appeared was the Sword Manor. He began to talk to Lavender about his plans as thoughts about the Sword Manor swam in his head. However, Lavender's mood didn't seem to improve. She still looked ill and unhappy, which was far from the valiant and murderous queen of killings. She now resembled a weak girl, which made men have an instinctive urge to protect her when they saw her. Zen was also concerned about this situation and asked her about it 2 or 3 times, but Lavender always changed the subject. She was even cold towards him. Zen was really clueless. These 3 places are very far away from each other. It would take at least 10 years to travel back and forth between 2 places, even with the speed of the fairy palace, Lavender said. She thought for a moment before another vague sentence spilled from her lips. From now on, you need to make decisions by yourself. Whoosh! Lavender suddenly dissipated in front of him, transforming into the sword spirit that entered his body. That made Zen even more confused. Not far away stood Freya, who watched the whole scene with a smile on her face. Lavender was cold and seldom talked to Freya. But Freya had stayed in this fairy palace for many years. A bystander is always clear-minded. She knew exactly what Lavender was thinking. Still, Lavender had always been by Zen's side. That made it hard for Freya to personally tell him about Lavender's situation. After a while, Zen came to a decision. And this time, he didn't forget that he had brought something else with him from the illusion battlefield. With a flip of his hand, a small token appeared on his palm. What is this? Freya asked curiously. Zen's lips curved into a small smile in response. This is a teleportation token. The teleportation token had allowed Zen to move back and forth within a supreme world in the illusion battlefield. That was why he had made a copy of the teleportation token and took it out of the battlefield. He wasn't sure if it would work in the universe, though. But there was no harm in trying, right? Chapter 1385. The Bright Sun World. The only way to move long distances in the universe was through spatial transference. One was required to have a deep understanding of the space law and reach the level of a world lord before carrying it out. The level of one's cultivation seemed to determine the distance they could reach. Because of this, the Supreme Lords who had wanted to capture Zen gathered together in a mere day or 2. The World Lords, however, had to wait a long time before they could catch up to them. Freya raised her hands to her cheeks. She did not understand what was happening, but she did not give voice to her doubts, satisfied to watch Zen's every move silently. Zen was unsure about using the teleportation token in the universe. Under the infusion of his chaotic energy, the token emitted a faint white light. Buzz. With a light chirp, the space around Zen began to vibrate. Yes. Zen's eyes lit up. However, the space only continued to tremble, as if a monster was trying to tear it apart. At the same time, muffled sounds were heard, similar to firecrackers exploding underwater. Plop, 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 plop. Freya took a few steps to the side. She was getting more and more confused. Does he want to summon a beast? She wondered, cocking her head. Eventually, the muted sounds died down. Did I fail? It can't be. Zen sighed, his brow creased slightly. If the teleportation token was rendered useless, it would not have caused such a commotion. However, he also did not sense any fluctuations from the space law. At this moment, a figure flew over to him. It was Saul. A strange expression appeared on Saul's face, his eyes seeming to pierce through Zen. Zen, did you plan on carrying out the spatial transference here? How did you know? Zen asked. Saul laughed and said, here, spatial transference is impossible. This time it was Zen's turn to stare. Why? Saul pointed toward the sky. The enchanted barrier enveloped the entire fairy palace. In reality, the fairy palace was not known to exist in the universe. It was located in a world where all things seemed giant in size. Zen had only utilized the token of mountain to create a node and an illusion. Only then did Saul tell Zen that even a true god would be unable to carry out spatial transference in the fairy palace, whereas Zen was only a warrior at the spirit supreme realm. He could just walk around. Are you serious? Zen was stunned. He had first felt the strangeness of the forest when encountering the white tiger, but he did not expect this place to be so different. Where is this place? Zen asked again. Saul only smiled mysteriously, saying that Zen would find out eventually, when the time came. Zen did not press him again. Saul had only told him a limited number of things. He would not tell Zen anything that he thought the latter should not know about. Sometimes, Zen doubted that the man was a mere puppet. Now that Zen could not carry out spatial transference in the fairy palace, he could only leave and enter the universe again to test his luck. But judging from the commotion he had just experienced, Zen estimated that the teleportation token would be effective. In fact, he was almost certain about it, so he decided to observe the situation in the outside world through the fairy palace. The world lords seemed to have been recalled back by their own great races, but Zen still had to be on his guard. Indeed, he had secured the so-called number 1 position in the illusion battlefield and was a favored warrior by fate, but that did not mean he would not die. If Elena arranged for a world lord to kill Zen in secret, it would only take an instant for him to bite the dust. Even though Zen had stepped into the Spirit Supreme realm and his cultivation level had greatly improved, he still could not think of any successful way he could face a world lord and emerge the victor. If he waited until he reached the spirit transformation realm and gained strength to fight a world lord, he would at least have the power to protect himself. Maybe then, he could even defeat one of the world lords. Zen had Sol control the fairy palace to fly away for a few days. He transmuted the fairy palace into a grain of sand and pierced through a star. After the fairy palace climbed out of the star, Zen immediately walked out of the palace. Freya had originally wanted to follow him out, but he stopped her in her tracks. He wanted her to stay back in the palace. The instant Zen left the fairy palace, he activated the teleportation token in his hand. As it activated, acute spatial fluctuations wrapped around him like a tornado. Buzz. At the moment, the teleportation token was connected to the entire universe. Zen fell into a strange space. Next, what appeared before him was a majestic scene. The stars in the sky seemed to have condensed together, densely packed like grains of dazzling sand. Below each grain was a disk. Zen's gaze wandered over them slowly, his face lighting up. He could see that each of the disks represented a supreme world. This was the epitome of the entire universe. The fact that the teleportation token could achieve this was almost beyond Zen's imagination. Thin lines were marked beneath each disk. The 100,000 disks represented 100,000 supreme worlds. The lines extended from the bottom of the disks all the way down. The other ends of the lines lead to the great worlds in the lower world. Zen's eyes twinkled. The lines were complicated, perhaps representing a series of ascending passageways. The entire universe had shrunk by a number of times and then materialized in front of him. Just one look alone was enough to shock him. Previously, when Zen had ascended and used his consciousness to travel in the universe, he had gazed down upon a million great worlds. However, at that time, he had not been able to look at their overall appearance. The great worlds in the distance had been hidden from his view, covered in darkness. Even now, Zen could not view the great worlds very clearly. However, he could see that the great worlds were split into 3 parts by the black fog. There were probably more than 1 million great worlds in the boundless universe. Many of lines that link these great worlds did not seem to extend to the upper world, instead reaching to other places. Soon, Zen understood that these particular places were separate in their own right, such as the genuine dragon world and the genuine phoenix world. He finally understood what was up as he stared at the rhombus-shaped great worlds. From the looks of it, the great worlds as a whole seemed like the back of some sort of vicious beast. The rhombus-shaped great worlds were the scales of the beast. Was he correct? Was it truly a vicious beast? Did such a creature actually exist in the universe? Zen did not understand the mysteries pertaining to the great worlds. With the teleportation token, he seemed to be able to choose his destination easily. After confirming his position, he floated toward one of the disks. He used the teleportation token so early. A faint smile appeared on the face of the mysterious girl, who was known as Irene Zhang. She stood amidst layers of clouds. Naturally, Zen was not aware that the impressive teleportation token had been created by her. A supreme lord could only use spatial transference time and again to cross supreme worlds. It was not easy to manipulate the direction of a long-distance teleportation. If a supreme lord did not pay enough attention, he might go to a wrong destination altogether. In order to reach their destination, one had to teleport dozens of times, or even 100 times. Devices such as the teleportation token, that made it rather easy to teleport, had never before appeared in the universe. Following a violent flash of light, Zen materialized at his destination out of thin air. The moment he came into view, he started dropping from the skies. Hastily, he circulated his chaotic energy to float in the air. At the moment, he found himself at the height of 100,000 feet. Before him were vast plains. It is the bright sun world, an independent supreme world, he murmured to himself, his gaze sweeping the area. Not all supreme worlds in the universe belong to the great powers. The Bright Sun world was a supreme world that belonged to independent warriors. It could be said that it was a place a number of independent warriors yearned to be at because of the renowned sword manor that was located here. Independent warriors were not restricted. All races were allowed to coexist in this particular supreme world. Strictly speaking, the sword manor was also one of the great powers. However, it did not impose too great of a restriction on the independent warriors that chose to join it. For those who desired freedom, it was, in fact, an excellent choice of destination. Zen had some priorities and many other questions to settle, but most important to him right now was to become a godly genius. For this purpose, the trip to Sword Manor was imperative to him. Flying high in the sky for some time, he took note of the various black dots on the plains. These could be villages and cities, but they appeared to be as small as ants. Zen immediately leaned to one side and shuttled downward. Chapter 1386. The Sword Manor. Although Zen had entered the Bright Sun world with his teleportation token, it would still take him a long time to pass through a supreme world. If he wanted to go to the Sword Manor, he had to go through the Supreme World Channel. Besides, he didn't know where exactly the Sword Manor was located, except that it was in the Bright Sun world. However, he soon realized that it wasn't that easy to enter the Sword Manor. He was halfway down when he suddenly smacked his forehead, then took out the token of mountain. Apparently, he had forgotten to release Freya. As for Saul the puppet, he could stay in the fairy place and it wouldn't matter, he had even remained in the fairy palace for thousands of years. Meanwhile, Livingston was too engrossed in weapon refining that no one could force him out now. However, Freya had stayed in the fairy palace for several years. When she asked to come out during the time Zen had just used the teleportation token, he rejected her. After all, there had been many uncertain dangers at that time. Thus, Freya always listened to Zen and never forced him. Zen wasn't afraid in any way, as even the Supreme Lords wouldn't be able to calculate that he had arrived in this Supreme World in just a short period of time. After he had activated the token of mountain, he began to communicate with the fairy palace. Freya eagerly waited at the door like she'd always have. If she felt that Zen was under pressure, she wouldn't go out, even if she was dying too. Still, she couldn't be blamed for getting bored after being trapped in the fairy palace for several years. The moment Zen transmitted his voice, Freya suddenly appeared beside him. Since she didn't expect Zen to be floating in the air when she appeared, she began to fall with a disheartening cry. Zen quickly pulled her hand and she was finally able to stabilize her body. Her eyes drifted to the vast plains in the universe, and she stretched her back with a satisfied smile. She had felt very much oppressed these years, but she never complained. She trailed Zen behind. Huge maple leaves, which exerted a faint force of the flying ban, began to appear when they were about 1,000 feet from the city. "Let's go in through the city gate," Zen said after he and Freya had both circled around the city for a while. After some investigation, they found out that this city was located in the north of the Bright Sun world, and the Sword Manor was located in the southeast of the Bright Sun world. Therefore, Zen paid a few Supreme Life Vitality crystals and brought Freya into the Space Channel, and then to the Supreme World Channel. The arduous journey took them nearly half a month to travel through the Supreme World Channel. Yet Freya was excited throughout the entire trip, like a prisoner who had been seemingly locked forever and had just obtained her freedom. On the other hand, Lavender had always been in a state of immersion as she hibernated within Zen's body. After half a month, they finally left the Supreme World Channel and arrived at the Sword Manor. While it was a proper manor, it didn't mean that it was weakly fortified. After all, the manor was considered the peak by independent warriors. Supreme lords like Sword Chen were from the Sword Manor. Freya was like a giddy little girl as she watched the light that was emitted by the space law dissipate, and she couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, "What a huge sword!" The Bright Sun world was a supreme world abundant in plains. After they exited the Space Channel, a large, flat city welcomed them. In the distance, a huge long sword stood firmly on the ground. The Supreme World Channel was extremely busy as a constant wave of people entered and exited. Someone couldn't help but roll his eyes when he heard Freya's words. "Look, we have a bumpkin," he muttered. Another man quickly interrupted him, warned him not to make irresponsible remarks, and then glanced apologetically at Zen. Zen had already reached the Spirit Supreme realm. Whenever his power increased by a level, so would his position in the eyes of those around him. A warrior in such a level could get a decent job in a 10th grade sacred place, so no ordinary warrior would want to provoke Zen. Yeah, it really is huge, Zen mentally estimated the sword's size as he looked at it. The man-made sword was probably over 100,000 feet high. It might be the symbolic building of the sword manor. He only had one goal, and that was to go to the sword manor to hone his sword intent. He hoped to perfect the emotion-closing godly way, so that his lotus flower could be perfect. It was known that the sword manor was a sacred place for all swordsmen. Even swordsmen from already powerful forces still went there to hone their sword intent. Lavender was one of them years ago. After spending several pieces of life vitality crystals, Zen made some inquiries from a local warrior. The warrior told him that the city where they were in was called Sword City, which boasted a strong swordsmanship atmosphere. There were also many sword schools throughout the city. It was said that even ordinary people received sword training for self-protection. "Sir, I'm afraid it won't be that convenient for you to visit the sword manor," the warrior said as he shook his head. "Why?" Zen asked. Was there something wrong with him? The warrior glanced at him and continued, "You're a powerful warrior of the Spirit Supreme Realm, and can be considered important among the independent warriors. However, a rule from the ancient times is being strictly followed. That is, to enter the sword manor, you must first enter the sword school and obtain the 9-star sword token." 9-star sword token? What's that? Zen asked. He was stunned. The warrior smiled and said, "You're a swordsman who has excellent achievements in the sword arts. Theoretically speaking, it wouldn't be hard to obtain the token. It's just that there are only 3 days left this month." Zen mentally sighed. He thought that he could enter the sword manor as he wished. He didn't know that there was such a rule. Based from the warrior's words, it seemed that the rule had never been broken before in the history of the sword manor. Sword Chen had previously left a sword-shaped mark on Zen's body, so it shouldn't be a problem for him to enter the sword manor. But since the warrior said that no one had ever broken the rule before, he decided to follow it as well. After Zen thanked the warrior for his time, he quickly learned that there were many sword schools around the sword manor. All of their students were swordsmen and martial artists, who would obtain their own sword tokens after a series of battles. He paused for a moment and thought. He entered the sword manor the moment he set foot in the Supreme World Channel. However, the sword manor in that sense was apparently a broad term, which could be a place name or a powerful force. The key to entering the real sword manor was the 9-star sword token. Thus, Zen asked the warrior to lead the way to a sword school without a second thought. After he entered a sword school he chose, he spent several life vitality crystals on a sword token of his own. Many swordsmen from outside worlds like Zen were in the sword school as well. They hit a bottleneck in their cultivation, so they wanted to enter the sword manor in hopes of breaking through their shackles. However, they didn't know that the former owner of this sword manor was Zen's mentor of sorts, Sword Chen. After a while, the sword school sent someone to fight Zen, but the man was only at the life and death realm. How could he compare to Zen? When he saw that Zen was at the Spirit Supreme Realm, he too knew his fate. The winner was decided after just a single sword attack. Their fight was only a formality anyway, and Zen left with a 2-star sword token. Next, Zen entered another relatively large sword school with the 2-star sword token he had just gotten. After another sword attack, he got out with a 3-star sword token. As Zen progressed, the schools he went to grew more imposing and larger in size. Naturally, his opponents also became increasingly formidable as well. However, he only needed one sword attack when he faced warriors of the life and death realm and the soul sea realm. A second move was unnecessary. In just half a day, Zen's token had gone from a 3-star one to a 6-star one already. Still, Zen's speed was nothing to be proud of because his cultivation level was high already. Besides, it was only the threshold to enter the sword manor. It would be a great insult to his dignity if he had encountered any difficulties there. Freya just followed Zen all throughout, bought a map of the sword manor and asked for some information in between. She quickly adapted to the new environment, so she was already able to serve as Zen's guide by the time he had gotten the 7-star token. Only 6 big sword schools can give out 8-star and 9-star sword tokens. And the closest one is in that direction, Freya said. She thought for a moment before she reminded him, these 6 big sword schools are equivalent to the 9th grade forces in the traditional sense. However, it should be very simple for you. Zen nodded. He was quite thankful for her presence, as the detailed information she had acquired was of great help to him. Chapter 1387, An Auction. This was the Breeze Sword School, one of the 6 sword schools under the Sword Manor. Warriors could obtain 8-star and 9-star tokens through here. And according to Zen's estimate, the ideal scenario would be for him to acquire the 9-star token in a single day. After all, it didn't take him long to travel through various sword schools in the process of obtaining 1-star to 7-star tokens. But after midday, when Zen and Freya finally arrived at the entrance of the Breeze Sword School, it had already closed its doors. "Seems like I have to stay for one more day," Zen said as he smiled helplessly. Many martial artists spent years obtaining the 1-star to 9-star sword tokens. Such was the path a swordsman had to take in order to grow. At these different sword schools, warriors improved themselves. When one's understanding of swordsmanship reached a certain level, they would naturally earn the right to enter the sword manor. For this reason, the sword manor attracted many of the independent warriors. The sword manor imposed no restrictions to them. So long as one focused on the path of swordsmanship and reached that standard of understanding, the manor selflessly opened its doors to them. Tens of thousands of people would kneel before some of the 10th grade sacred places, as they weren't allowed to enter. Such a scene wouldn't happen to the sword manor's entrance. But Zen wasn't one of those swordsmen. He managed to obtain the 7-star sword token in a mere day. "We need to find a place to stay tonight. We'll return tomorrow," Zen said. "Can we take a walk around the city?" Freya said timidly, her voice soft. Upon hearing her small request, Zen smiled. "Why not?" With that, Freya's face turned somewhat joyful. She was a naturally shy person, not used to expressing her feelings openly. But she was beyond happy at this moment. Soon after, Freya heard of a market in the city and suggested they visit. Ever since Zen had ascended, he never understood the human culture of the upper world. This was probably the first time he even had the chance to wander around the market. Although he asked Lavender if she wanted to join them, he earned no response. At the market, the place was bustling with noise and excitement. Almost all the people there were independent warriors. The warriors of the large forces and sacred places had the support of pills and cultivation methods. With these benefits, they could concentrate on cultivation with the price of helping the large forces or sacred places complete missions. But the independent warriors were different. The independent warriors had no such benefits. They had to work hard on everything themselves. Some explored the secret places and collected items that they could use for trade on the market. As he walked through the market, Zen didn't seem all too interested. But Freya's head was turning left and right, buying many small, interesting items. They usually cost several supreme life vitality crystals. After circling the market a few times, Zen realized that the size of the market went beyond his expectations. Many of the warriors were at the life and death realm, and some were at the soul sea realm. Along the way, he met several spirit supreme realm warriors. After walking around, Zen guessed that Freya took him to that market because it was one of the more high-end in the city. There were even some warriors trading divine weapons. Suddenly, a hubbub of noise came from ahead. "The auction is about to begin. Let's go. It should be the last 3 9-star sword tokens for this month. If we miss this chance, we won't get another. But the price is ridiculously high. Where can we even collect so many life vitality jades?" As the warriors rushed toward the commotion, Zen and Freya glanced at each other, both with doubt filling their eyes. They could buy 9-star sword tokens with life vitality jades. From the previous sword schools, Zen also knew that a sword token was an acknowledgement of a swordsman. He couldn't believe that someone could buy a 9-star sword token in the auction. As Zen silently moved through the crowd, Freya followed close behind him. Zen's silhouette seemed to flicker as he silently moved through the crowd. A tall platform stood in the middle of the market. On it, there were 3 Spirit Supreme Realm warriors. Seeing that almost everyone was here, the leading Spirit Supreme Realm warrior shouted coldly, "The 497 9-star sword tokens of the 500 were already sold out. If you missed out on this opportunity, you'd have to wait until the next month. The starting bid is 100 life vitality jades." As the echoes of his voice faded, the warriors below all began bidding. 110, 115, 120. Basically, the bidders were all warriors at the Soul Sea realm. There were a few warriors at the Spirit Supreme realm who also called out a price. Zen's frown deepened at the sight. Previously, he had held a trace of admiration toward the Sword Manor. It was a righteous deed to open up the manor to all swordsmen in the universe. As the saying went, a person who selects a sword as their weapon has an air of righteousness. But this event had him doubting. "My friend, what do you mean by auctioning a sword token? Isn't the sword token something that we obtain through a swordsmanship competition?" Zen asked the warrior beside him. When the martial artist next to him heard his words, he released a cold laugh and said, "You're talking about an old time and age. A 9-star token enables a warrior to enter the sword manor. How could there even be such a good thing in the world? But isn't this the rule of the sword manor? If they do this, wouldn't it mean that they are plotting against the sword manor for their own benefit?" Zen asked once again. Initially, he thought that he'd be able to enter the Sword Manor in the following day. But judging from the current situation, it wasn't that easy to obtain a 9-star sword token. Although he wasn't raising his voice, the Spirit Supreme Realm warrior on stage could hear him. This warrior stared angrily at Zen before raising the 9-star sword token in his hand. He walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at Zen. "My friend, you must be joking. The 9-star sword tokens were given to us by the Sword Manor. What's it to you if we auction them?" To that, Zen raised his head and coolly asked, "Then, if I were to compete in the Breeze Sword School tomorrow, wouldn't I be left unable to obtain a 9-star token?" This earned a sneer from the other party. "Of course not. If you want to obtain one from the Sword School, then you have to wait another month. There are 10 9-star sword tokens warriors can obtain through competition. That will depend on whether or not you even have the ability to." Haha. With the rise of Supreme Lord Sword, the name of the Sword Manor spread far and wide, drawing in more and more martial artists to train there. Not only were there many independent warriors, but there was also quite a number of swordsmen from great powers as well. But only 500 warriors could enter the Sword Manor every month. These 500 9-star tokens were all in the hands of the 6 major sword schools. Initially, they could follow the rules, but with the disappearance of Supreme Lord Sword, the warriors of the Sword Manor grew greedier. So while the rules laid out by Supreme Lord Sword were still there, no one followed them anymore. "You're breaking the rules of the Sword Manor," Zen exclaimed icily. He respected Supreme Lord Sword, after all. Zen had comprehended the god's intimidating strike first and had been personally trained by Supreme Lord Sword in the Hall of Causality. He could be counted as Zen's half-a master. Supreme Lord Sword definitely wasn't aware that the warriors of the Sword Manor could easily sell the sword tokens for money after he had disappeared. The warrior standing on the high platform originally wore a smile on his face, but after hearing what Zen said, his expression turned cold. "Kid, this is the Sword Manor. You'd better watch your mouth. If you don't have money, then scram. Be an eyesore somewhere else." The rude words were a sign that he didn't take Zen's cultivation at the Spirit Supreme Realm seriously at all. Another warrior on the high platform let out an eerie laugh. "The price of a 9-star sword token is hardly expensive. It usually costs only 200 or 300 life vitality jades. If you're so desperate for it and you don't have money, just give me that Soul Sea Realm servant girl. I'll give you enough life vitality jades for a 9-star token." The martial artist's greedy eyes fell right on Freya. There weren't many female warriors who had reached the Soul Sea Realm, and there were even fewer women among the independent warriors. The warrior had clearly taken a fancy to Freya's looks. When he saw how she followed behind Zen, a devious idea came to mind. Zen's gaze turned cold instantly and faint killing intent flashed across his eyes when he heard the warrior's venomous words. The martial artists that were initially participating in the auction had immediately stayed away from Zen as much as they could. These independent warriors were smart enough to know that Zen was in deep trouble. All the while, they wondered who this young man was. For someone who was just at the Spirit Supreme Realm, he behaved so arrogantly. Anyone could guess that he would end up in a miserable state. Most of the independent warriors thought the same as they looked at Zen. These guys were all swordsmen. Some of them had even gone bankrupt crossing over supreme worlds just to get here. It was all to enter the Sword Manor and climb up a level in the swordsman's path. But much to their dismay, they realized that they had to spend money to earn the qualifications needed to enter the Sword Manor. It was quite a disappointment. Chapter 1388. The School Leader. Everyone on the platform looked down on Zen. The auction of the 9-star sword tokens was already a matter approved by the Sword Manor. Even life vitality jades obtained from the auction would be handed over to the manor according to a certain percentage. These were the set rules of the Sword Manor. Any trouble Zen seemed to be stirring would be met with his quick extermination. Many of the warriors guessed that he was probably an independent warrior without a backer. This made it easier for them since nobody would question the death of an insignificant independent warrior. Freya was currently feeling extremely guilty. She had once again brought trouble to Zen, but she didn't really have a choice. Even if she didn't bring him to the market tonight, he wouldn't be able to get a 9-star sword token from the Breeze Sword School tomorrow either. A shiver went down her spine when she noticed the strange gazes of the warriors. However, she didn't say anything. She merely stood to the side and waited for Zen to make his move. "Will you give your servant girl to me?" the warrior on the platform asked. He knew Zen would not be willing to do as he asked, and he was really just making fun of him. He knew that the young man wouldn't dare make a move in here. If Zen was someone capable and powerful, then why would he need a 9-star sword token to enter the Sword Manor? That place was very welcoming with geniuses who came from major powers. There would have been no need for tokens. Anyone who had to compete for the 9-star sword token was most likely an independent warrior. Ha ha, Zen sneered as he gave that warrior a piercing glare. He didn't really want to cause any trouble either. All he really wanted to do was follow the path set by Supreme Lord Sword in order to advance his swordsmanship. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible. It seemed he would have to represent Supreme Lord Sword to teach these guys a lesson. However, just as he was about to make his move, a thick, malicious aura burst forth from his body. Fighting was strictly prohibited in the market, and not many people were willing to break the rules. This was why nobody really panicked when a slender figure shot out of Zen's body and zoomed towards the platform. The warriors were initially relaxed. However, their moods took a turn when the arrival of this figure plunged their hearts down to their stomachs. The air around them felt stifling as if they had drawn the ire of someone they should never have messed with. The slender figure that zoomed towards them was none other than Lavender. Her reaction was somewhat strange. Ever since Zen had returned from the illusion battlefield, he had noticed her being more quiet than usual. She was very happy to see the saint-killing spear, but she didn't really say anything after that. Lavender never really talked much in the past, but this time felt different. It was as if she simply didn't have the energy to talk at all. So seeing her so pumped up right now was surprising, but it also meant that things were about to get complicated real soon. These people had been rude to him, so Zen naturally wouldn't let them off. He had planned to teach them a lesson, but never planned on killing them. Lavender's appearance changed things. He just knew she wasn't going to let these warriors leave this place alive. The three warriors all thought Zen wouldn't dare make a move. None of them expected the sudden appearance of this strange, scary figure. All three of them had a bad premonition with regards to this terrifying figure. All of a sudden, 3 swords appeared beside each of them. Most of Lavender's soul had already been restored. Zen's sword spirit had also helped in substantially increasing her strength. The only thing she lacked now was a body. These Spirit Supreme Realm warriors did not stand a chance at all. One of them pulled out a sword and held it against Lavender. Her hand briefly brushed past the blade and, for some reason, it jumped into her hand. The moment it went to her hand, the sword swung down and cut its former wielder's throat. The warrior wanted to dodge, but Lavender's eyes and the massive soul pressure had rendered him immobile. As the sword slashed his throat, another figure flew past them. Puff! There was a loud sound as the figure launched his attack. It was Zen. With a powerful punch, he sent the Spirit Supreme Realm warrior flying. However, Lavender wasn't yet finished. She grabbed the sword and turned it towards her. Without any hesitation, she stabbed it through her own armpit and towards another Spirit Supreme Realm warrior behind her. Bam! Zen went in for another punch. The person was also sent flying and most probably only had half his life left. What are you doing? Lavender yelled at him angrily. She then shifted her gaze to the last Spirit Supreme Realm warrior standing. Before she could do anything, Zen had already gone ahead and punched him. These people were rude, but we can just teach them a lesson. No need to kill them, he told her. Lavender stared at him blankly. Instead of replying, she simply threw down the sword before turning into specks of red light and flying straight into his body. A trace of helplessness appeared on Zen's face. He was extremely confused with Lavender's thoughts and actions. Zen, the 9-star sword tokens. Freya reminded him. She held up 2 tokens in her hands, having obtained them during the chaos. Zen did not even try to justify this method of obtaining the tokens. Since these people did not allow him to obtain one cleanly through the swordsmanship competition, then he could only resort to such underhanded means. The warriors beneath the platform were hunched over in hushed discussion. There was no denying that Zen's actions shocked them completely. None of them clearly saw what happened after Lavender appeared. They heard a couple of loud sounds and then the figure suddenly burst into tiny specks of red light that were absorbed into Zen's body. It was only after this that they realized that it was probably Zen's sword spirit. That sword spirit's soul force is so powerful. Her malicious aura was so intense, right? I don't know where this guy came from, but I think he's going to suffer the consequences of causing such a ruckus here. These people should have known who Zen was. In fact, everyone in the universe should know his name. It was rare to see a human martial artist using a demon knight woman for a sword spirit, after all. However, the universe was simply boundless and it was impossible for these people to think that Zen, the champion of the illusion battlefield, would actually appear in front of them. What was more unbelievable was the fact that he was ready to fight others for the sake of 9-star sword tokens. The Sword Manor had an illusion space, but only core members were qualified to view the illusion battlefield through it. The warriors in the market were all disciples of various sword schools and none had gotten the opportunity to see Zen's face on the painting scroll. Zen took the 2 tokens from Freya. Just as he was about to put them away, 3 people on flying swords came over from the sky. Flying was prohibited in the cities within the Sword Manor's vicinity. Warriors would normally not exceed a height of 100 feet since the air restriction barrier would be triggered. However, these 3 were evidently not affected by the restriction. The one on the lead looked really angry. Who dares to cause trouble here? He is a spirit transformation realm warrior, Zen murmured to himself. Had it been before, Zen would have already hightailed it out of there. However, he now more or less had the strength to fight against a spirit transformation realm warrior. The thing was, there were 3 spirit transformation realm warriors. This market was originally under the jurisdiction of the Breeze Sword School 4 or 5 miles away. This distance was nothing to a warrior. Nobody would dare cause trouble here under normal circumstances. One of the people who rushed over was the leader of the Breeze Sword School while the other 2 were higher-ups of the Sword Manor. Keen, the leader, was a short-tempered man and quickly turned black in anger when he saw 3 of his men unconscious. He quickly unsheathed his sword and slashed out a sharp cyan sword light towards Zen's direction. There was no hesitation on his part. He aimed at Zen for the kill. The people in the market all cried out and fled in different directions. Getting caught in the middle of this fight would only lead to their early death. Keen's temper was notorious. Watching this fight would be interesting, but putting their lives on the line wasn't really worth it. Those further away couldn't help but sigh. That man is still so young. It's a pity he's going to lose his life like this. Meh, does he really think he could stroll around here causing trouble left and right without paying a price? He is arrogant and he deserves to die. To the independent warriors present, causing a ruckus in the Sword Manor was equivalent to suicide. Chapter 1389. Zen's identity was revealed. The cyan beam of light was so powerful. It felt as if it could split open space. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary though, considering that the Breeze Sword School leader was at the spirit transformation realm. His inner world was already mature and his powers were understandably daunting. Humph! Zen huffed and raised his hand. The Thunder Wind Divine Sword released a slash of its own, countering the opposing cyan beam. Sizzle! The moment the 2 sword radiance beams collided, the surrounding space split into huge fragments. These fragments were visibly torn with their edges looking as if they had been bitten off by a large, celestial dog. For this attack, Zen only used around 80% of his strength, but it was enough to annihilate that cyan beam. He hadn't even employed the chaotic god's intimidating strike yet. The immediate vicinity was currently deserted since those who had been standing nearby immediately ran away to avoid getting in the middle of the crossfire. However, they maintained a close enough distance to still watch what was happening. The Breeze Sword School leader was famous for his hot temper, but they didn't need to be afraid since he wasn't mad at them. All of them wanted to see what would happen to this young man that had the unfortunate fate of angering the master. Zen's counter of the master's attack shocked many in the audience. This young man was only at the early stage of the Spirit Supreme realm, but he was already able to counter the Breeze Sword School leader's powerful attack. How is this possible? He's only at the Spirit Supreme realm, but he blocked the master's sword so easily. Is he an ace talent from some great power? Zen had encountered quite a few ace talents back in the illusion battlefield. However, the chances of encountering an ace talent here outside the illusion battlefield were actually very low. There were 100,000 supreme worlds and no more than 1,000 ace talents in the universe, which meant the probability of encountering one was actually less than meeting a saint lord of a sacred place. He can't be. Why would an ace talent need a 9-star sword token to enter the Sword Manor? If he really was an ace talent, then the Sword Manor leader himself would have personally come out to greet him. Moreover, he'd be backed by supreme lords. Then who is this fellow? The Breeze Sword School leader was equally surprised at what just transpired. A person at the Spirit Supreme realm who could withstand and counter his strike must not be looked down upon. Zen must at least be an ace talent if he was able to do that. The leader began to feel a bit strange, especially since he noticed Zen's composure, which meant he hadn't used his full strength. However, this was still his territory and the effective counter of his strike just served to both humiliate and annoy him. He pushed aside all his earlier thoughts and prepared to give Zen another strike, this time using his full strength. Just as he was about to raise his hand though, a powerful arm grabbed him. Keen? No, it was the senior steward of the Sword Manor. He was Kaden Han, who was responsible for communications with other sword schools outside of the Sword Manor. During the illusion battlefield matches, he paid close attention to all the events. The faces of all 300 people in the picture were deeply imprinted in his mind, more so the top 10 warriors. He felt Zen was somewhat familiar at first glance when he had followed Keen here. It had been dark and it was difficult to really make out his face under the dim lamplight, but he immediately recognized the Thunderwind Divine Sword. When the Breeze Sword School leader launched the first attack, Caden Han had a feeling it wouldn't end well. The moment he saw Zen block the master's attack so easily, admiration bloomed in Caden Han's heart. He was indeed worthy of his title of Illusion Battlefield Champion, the main character of this era. Seeing that the Breeze Sword School leader was about to raise his hand, Caden Han naturally stopped him. "Why did you stop me?" The leader burst out in anger. He had already been embarrassed so much, but he at least should get an explanation. He didn't really care what reason Caden Han had in stopping him, but he at least wanted to find a way out and save his face. "Didn't you find his sword technique very special?" Caden Han said with a faint smile. The leader frowned. He thought about it for a second before his face suddenly darkened. Sword technique. This fellow cultivated Supreme Lord Sword's sword technique. Supreme Lord Sword was the Sword Manor's former leader. Using his own strength, he led the previously insignificant Sword Manor to greatness, ascending 2 levels and becoming the greatest force amongst the independent martial artists. The Sword Manor respected freedom and did not restrain independent martial artists nor expand their territory, which meant they did not develop into a sacred place. However, its influence was long-standing and had since surpassed what normal, second-grade races normally had. There were countless sword techniques in the Sword Manor. However, there was one that was considered of the supreme level, Supreme Lord Sword's swordsmanship. Unfortunately, Supreme Lord Sword did not pass his swordsmanship down to anyone. The only thing he left behind was a poem in the Orange Sea world. The Sword Manor once sent a large number of warriors into the Orange Sea world in an attempt to figure out their old master's secret. Sadly, the warriors ultimately failed and returned to the Sword Manor with nothing. A few years ago, back when the Humanity Alliance still hadn't expelled the outsiders from their land, there were still some independent warriors who meditated there. In the end, nobody inherited Supreme Lord Sword's ultimate sword technique. However, the Sword Manor recently found a person who managed to almost perfectly hone Supreme Lord Sword's ultimate sword technique and used it in his battles in the Illusion Battlefield. That person was none other than Zen. But wasn't Zen supposed to be trapped in the Middle Sky region? The Illusion Battlefield just ended. Why in the world was he here? Did he perhaps come here to the Sword Manor? How in the world did he manage to get here so fast? Even a Supreme Lord couldn't have done that. The Breeze Sword School leader was a shrewd man. Since the person in front of him was Zen, then this mishap would be easily handled. He would have been disgraced had it been an ordinary warrior of the Spirit Supreme realm. His pride would never be able to take the knowledge of having lost to someone who was of a lower level than him. However, losing to Zen was a different matter altogether. He was a legendary figure who was hailed as someone who would be the #1 warrior of the universe in the future. Realizing this, the master let out a laugh. "Ha ha, I was wondering who this person was. It turns out to be the godly genius, Zen Luo. You should have told us in advance that you were coming, young man. It is our fault that we failed to greet you in due manner. Forgive me, I lost my temper just now. I'm so sorry." It was rare for someone of his status to apologize so quickly and humbly. The master would be lying if he said he wasn't feeling any embarrassment right now. Fortunately, the name, Zen Luo, was enough to ease his embarrassment. So long as he revealed the young man's identity, then the master's face would be saved. Caden Han also took a step forward. He cupped his hands in front of Zen. "I am Caden Han from the Sword Manor. A godly genius has come to visit us and we were so rude to you. We're so sorry. Please accept my apology." Zen hadn't really become a godly genius, but that wasn't important. Since he defeated godly geniuses, then he was someone who had the potential to become a true god in the future. Zen Luo, the champion of the Illusion Battlefield. No way, but why would he come to our Sword Manor? The crowd murmured in amazement upon realizing just who this young man was. A person like Zen should have gone to the Celestial Position, the Thoughtless Minds, or the Humanity Alliance. The Sword Manor was nothing compared to these great powers. If Supreme Lord Sword was still around, then it might still be considered as a place for Zen to come to, but since he was gone, there wasn't really any reason why he'd bother to be here. 2 of the 3 warriors that Zen attacked previously had now awoken but almost passed out again after hearing Caden Han's words. "Dang, if you told us who you were earlier, then we would have given you this 9-star sword token for free," they thought to themselves. However, they noticed something strange about this arrangement. "Since you're Zen, what did you need this 9-star sword token for? You could go straight to the Sword Manor and nobody will stop you." The two continued to fume in their minds but did not dare show it in their faces. They hoped to the high heavens that Zen would let them go, otherwise the Breeze Sword school leader would blame them and that would be their end. One of the warriors was still unconscious and he was the one who dared to ask Zen to give Freya to him. If he knew the young man's true identity, there was no doubt that he would faint again instantly. Zen's cold expression softened, however, his mocking tone told them of his still apparent annoyance with what just happened. I have long heard of the Sword Manor as a sacred place for independent warriors. I did not know it would be a place that was so hard to enter. The warriors don't rely on their insight or passion in swordsmanship, instead, they rely on the life vitality crystals in their pockets. I wonder what Supreme Lord Sword would think if he knew about this. When he comes back and sees what the Sword Manor has become, I'm afraid he will be very disappointed. His words echoed in the minds of the independent warriors present. They had trekked all this way because of their obsession with swordsmanship and their hopes to further hone their sword techniques in order to obtain a more powerful sword intent. However, once they arrived, they quickly discovered that they must spend their life vitality jades in order to gain entry to the Sword Manor. They felt extremely disappointed. Caden Han's eyes lit up from Zen's words. Instead of focusing on the fact that he just shaded the Sword Manor, he was more concerned with the implication of what the young man said: Supreme Lord Sword still hadn't died. As he thought about this, his expression grew even more sincere. The mechanism of obtaining the 9-star sword token is indeed improper. I will report this to the senior leaders in order to make the necessary adjustments. Since you have come all this way, it may be best to come to the Sword Manor and have a chat. Chapter 1390, Meaning. Zen had only wanted to teach the practitioners of the Breeze Sword School a lesson that they would not forget. He hadn't planned on taking their lives. Caden's sincerity somehow managed to calm his anger, so he decided to let their rudeness pass. But what can I do with these 2 9-star tokens? He wondered to himself. He knew that Caden would lead him directly to the Sword Manor, so the sword tokens were no longer required for him to be allowed entrance. After careful consideration, he placed the 2 sword tokens on the platform and addressed the warriors who had been curious at the commotion. I'll leave the sword tokens to you. You may compete for them through fair sparring matches to see who deserve to take them. Elated, the warriors cheered excitedly upon hearing his words. There weren't many of them present at that time, so they all had a good chance of obtaining a 9-star sword token. For these independent warriors, several hundred life vitality jades were a great fortune. They could instead save the money up to obtain more resources for cultivation. Zen was astonished at the warriors' fervent reaction at his words. Freya, on the contrary, just smiled softly and followed behind Zen quietly as he approached Caden. Caden handed each of them a token that had a divine texture. It exempted the bearer from the no-flight ban surrounding the Sword Manor. Ordinary people were restricted from flying at high altitudes in the area. The only people who dared to fly highly around the Sword Manor all had great backgrounds. Predictably, the headquarters of the Sword Manor was the enormous sword that Zen and Freya had observed earlier. This gargantuan sword was actually a huge building. Even for martial artists, this building was indeed a colossal feat of architecture. It must have taken thousands of years to fully complete this building. After some time, Zen was finally shown to the top floor of the huge building. The colossal sword seemed to be stabbed into the ground, so the so-called top floor was at the very end of the hilt. From the perspective of an observer from afar, it looked like an emerald jade pearl was inlaid into the hilt of the sword. When he got closer, Zen realized that this jade pearl was much bigger than what it seemed to him. It was almost the size of a hill. Its smooth surface was polished to a shine, and its inside was hollowed out skillfully into a large room. It was, no doubt, a masterpiece. Noticing Zen's look of total amazement, Caden explained, actually, in the very beginning, the Sword Manor was located in the city. This sword-like building was erected after Supreme Lord Sword had already made himself known throughout the universe. Zen nodded in acknowledgement. In this universe, the Supreme Lords had the highest level of power. With the size of the Sword Manor, producing a Supreme Lord like Supreme Lord Sword was indeed the peak of their power. After entering the hall within the huge pearl, Caden motioned for Zen to take a seat and ordered a maidservant to pour him a cup of tea. Freya had the impulse to stand behind Zen. She really considered herself as Zen's handmaid and acted that way. However, Zen asked her to sit next to him. She was very meticulous and always organized things well for Zen, but he never treated her as his servant. After a few minutes, a white-robed, middle-aged man slowly walked towards them from the other side of the hall. The man walked with a steady pace, emanating an aura that was befitting of his strength as a world lord. The first man was followed by two similarly white-robed old men bearing swords on their backs, both also at World Lord's level. Judging from their strengths, Zen estimated that the overall force of the sword manor was actually stronger than an ordinary 10th grade sacred place. Based on the grading standards for sects in the universe, a sacred place could achieve the highest grade of 10. But, disregarding that fact, Zen thought that the sword manor could well be regarded as a 12th grade sacred place. Zen inferred that the middle-aged man was Finch Bai, the head of Sword Manor, as Caden had already familiarized Zen with his name earlier. "It's a great pleasure to meet you, sir," Zen greeted the older man with cupped hands as he stood from his seat. "Same here, Zen, you're a young hero. The sword slash you performed in the illusion battlefield really impressed us all. Please call me by my first name, Finch." The older man was bold and direct. Zen smiled and replied, "I'm honored." Finch was enthusiastic to meet Zen, but not just because he had won first place in the illusion battlefield. He was more interested about the matter that Caden had reported to him, that Supreme Lord Sword might still be alive. After it had been known throughout the entire Humanity Alliance that Zen was practicing the gods' intimidating strike, the news had also traveled quickly to the Sword Manor. They had always been attentive to all news that might be related to the poem that Supreme Lord Sword had left on the giant rock. What message did Supreme Lord Sword encrypt in that poem? Was it an important secret? How did Zen know that he was still alive? These were the questions that had been in the foremost of Finch's mind. For a force like the Sword Manor, losing a Supreme Lord was undoubtedly a big loss. Therefore, during the past years, the Sword Manor proclaimed that Supreme Lord Sword was missing instead of dead. At the very least, a missing Supreme Lord seemed much more intimidating instead of a dead one. However, Supreme Lord Sword's crown of destiny had disappeared from the universe, and it seemed that a new crown of destiny had taken its place. Knowing that, only those who were not aware of the matter believed the Sword Manor's statements. After the initial salutations, Finch went straight to the matter he was most concerned about. He didn't even bother to interrogate Zen about his intentions for coming to Sword Manor, but instead asked, "As the current leader of the Sword Manor, I have one important thing to clarify with you. Caden mentioned in his report that Supreme Lord Sword is still alive. Is that true?" Zen was taken aback. He hadn't expected that his careless comments earlier would strongly pique Finch's interest. He recalled seeing the soul mark of Supreme Lord Sword among the ranks of the true gods in the Hall of Causality, and once again confirmed that there was a high probability that Supreme Lord Sword had become a true god. He nodded his head in acquiescence. Finch's expression briefly revealed his excitement. Although it sounded improbable, he would much rather believe that it was true. Truth be told, they were almost certain that Supreme Lord Sword had passed away, ever since his crown of destiny had disappeared. But Finch always held on to a glimmer of hope in his mind. But that's impossible. After his crown of destiny disappeared, a new Supreme Lord from another race carried the heavenly destiny. There are only 128 Supreme Lords in the present universe. Is he really still alive? One of the old men behind Finch stepped forward and asked in an urgent tone. Zen grimaced a bit. The old man quickly presented the evidences to nullify his words, but it was obvious that he was anticipating about Supreme Lord Sword's status. His self-contradicting words echoed the internal turmoil of the thoughts in his mind. Of course, Zen understood how they felt as Supreme Lord Sword was an integral part of the Sword Manor. "It's true that Supreme Lord Sword is still alive," Zen repeated. "As for his crown of destiny, it must have disappeared because he is no longer a Supreme Lord." "What happened to him?" Finch asked incredulously. "He has become a true god," Zen smiled as he proclaimed the words. "What? This is even more impossible. A Supreme Lord can never become a true god. To become a true god in the universe, one must fulfill the condition of being a godly genius first. After the Supreme Lords carried the heavenly destiny, it was impossible for them to cultivate to become a true god, as the heavenly destiny already bound them to this universe. They could only cultivate to reach the limit in this universe set by the heavenly destiny, but they could never exceed that limit. The World Lords found this to be more unbelievable than the fact that Supreme Lord Sword was still alive. Seeing their puzzled expressions, Zen shrugged his shoulders and recounted to them all that he had observed in the Hall of Causality. "If you still can't believe me, I can prove the truth of my words with this." Zen raised his arm to show them something. Soon, a sword-shaped mark materialized on his arm. When Finch and the two old men laid their eyes on the sword-shaped mark on Zen's arm, their facial expressions changed at the same time. Zen was dumbfounded. Their astonishment was so exaggerated, it was almost comical. After all, they were three dignified world lords. Zen still hadn't realized the importance of the sword-shaped mark at that time. He thought it was only a token of the Supreme Lord's message so that his safety was ensured when he entered the Killing Sword Mountain to hone his swordsmanship. However, to the sword manor, this sword-shaped mark meant a great deal more than that. Chapter 1391, Whispering Sword. As world lords, Finch and the two elders behind him knew the rules and restraints better than Zen. A Supreme Lord had become a true god. Such thing had never ever happened before. This was why it was hard for them to believe that it was possible. World lords could become true gods. Though the chance was very small, there was a few possibilities. However, after a Supreme Lord bore the heavenly destiny, this possibility would be eliminated because they would never cross the current round of heavens. However, this time everyone in the universe had already seen how Shania crossed the restraints of the heavens easily. The rules and restraints might be rigid, but people were flexible. Sword Chen was a talent from the Sword Manor, and he might be able to break these rules. Zen himself could not figure it out. He knew that Sword Chen had become a true god only because he had seen Sword Chen have a position in the corridor of Emperor. Maybe the key was in the emotion-closing godly way cultivated by Sword Chen. I wonder where you got the news from. Have you met Supreme Lord Sword before? Finch asked. Zen nodded and said, that's right. The reason I came to the Sword Manor is because I have talked to him once. And I want to continue to cultivate my sword intent here. Seeing the world lords still had some doubts, he raised his arm to prove the truth of his words. A bright blue light emitted from a sword-shaped mark on the upper part of his arm. This sword-shaped mark was inscribed into Zen's arm by Supreme Lord Sword. Finch did not speak. The two elders behind him suddenly cried, Whispering Sword. How on earth did you get that? Though these two elders had lived for many years, as world lords, they didn't have the demeanor that the world lords usually had. When Zen stood up, Freya followed him. She found the world lords, shocked faces funny. The world lords were the ones who controlled one supreme world each. How could they be so uncool? It had not been too long since Freya ascended to the upper world. Moreover, she spent most of her time in the fairy palace, so naturally she didn't know that these three people who had taken charge of the Sword Manor were not ordinary people, especially Finch, the head of the Sword Manor. Not only was he considered to be very strong among the world lords, but he could also be compared to the grand world lords of the great forces. If he wasn't here, it would be hard for the Sword Manor to manage such a situation without Supreme Lord Sword. Freya was also wondering what the Whispering Sword was. Zen was also puzzled. He looked at the three world lords, hoping that they would give him an answer. He originally thought that the sword-shaped mark was just a token of Supreme Lord Sword. Seeing the reaction of the three people around him, he realized that this definitely was not an ordinary mark. If that was the case, why did Sword Chen give him the mark? The two elders fell silent as they regarded Zen with an odd look. Even Finch, the most poised one, frowned slightly as he looked Zen up and down. Zen felt nervous under his sharp gaze. Whispering Sword, what's that? Zen asked. However, Finch did not reply, instead he just stared at him. After a long while, he sighed deeply and said, Zen, if you don't mind, please stay in my Sword Manor tonight. I can only answer this question tomorrow. Zen was puzzled, but since Finch was the owner of the Sword Manor, and he was a guest, he had no option but to be patient and wait. After arranging the rooms for Zen and Freya, Finch and the two elders went to the Sword Heart Pavilion in the Sword Manor. Finch took out a jade sword and tossed it upwards. The jade sword pierced through the ceiling of the Sword Heart Pavilion and flew high in the air. It turned into hundreds of green sword shadows and exploded all around. In the late hours of the night, the explosion looked like dazzling fireworks. After the sword shadows exploded, people in the Sword Manor flew toward the Sword Heart Pavilion on their swords. The people who ignored the no-fly ban of the Sword Manor enjoyed a high status in the Sword Manor. Sir, Master Bai, why have you summoned us at this late hour? The warriors who were summoned there were all sword cultivators, and their cultivation ranged from the late stage of the spirit transformation realm to the level that was a half step away from a world lord. They were the elders in the sword house of the Sword Manor. They were also the backbone of the Sword Manor. Since Finch had suddenly sent for them in the middle of the night, the elders who had arrived there in haste thought that something important might have happened. They inquired reason anxiously, however, Finch just shook his head and didn't say a word. Once all 27 elders in the sword house arrived, Finch spoke, I call upon you all at this hour because I have to discuss an important thing with you. A look of worry appeared on the elders' faces. Hearing Finch's serious voice, they couldn't help but wonder whether the crisis of the universe broke out earlier than they expected and if the spot was their very own Sword Manor. If so, that would be terrible news. The Whispering Sword has appeared, Finch said in a low voice. The elders were stunned. That's impossible. The Supreme Lord had died so many years ago. If he had left the Whispering Sword behind, it would have appeared long ago. How can it appear suddenly now? You're right. If someone had got their hands on the Whispering Sword, they would have showed up earlier. We won't allow anyone to control the Sword Manor just because the Whispering Sword is in their possession. Master Bai is our one and only leader. Everyone was speaking excitedly, and soon there was a din in the Sword Heart Pavilion. Finch waved his hand to them to signal for silence, and the commotion immediately died down in the Sword Heart Pavilion. He then announced the other news: Supreme Lord Sword is not dead. We are aware that he is not dead and he is just missing, but we also know that this is just our official statement, someone said in confusion. They were all puzzled as to why Finch was announcing something that they already knew. Finch explained, he is not dead nor is he missing. He has become a true god and has moved to the Divine Land. What? How is that possible? Master Bai, are you feeling unwell? You must be very tired. The elders' reaction was much more exaggerated than that of Finch and the two elders. This news erased everything they knew about Supreme Lord Sword. Finch continued, actually, I haven't personally seen our old master. I found out about this from Zen. Zen, the top warrior of the illusion battlefield. The one who won the chance to lead the world of chaos several days ago. What has he come to the Sword Manor for? I heard that he is trapped in the Middle Sky region, isn't he? It became noisy once again in the Sword Heart Pavilion. The elders were usually calm and composed, but this time, because of the shocking news, they became very agitated. Finch commanded them to calm down again. Everyone, be quiet. He continued, I don't know whether what Zen said is true or not. After all, there is no evidence. But I am certain about one thing. I and the two elders did see Supreme Lord Sword's Whispering Sword on Zen's arm. His words had the desired effect and everyone fell silent again. Nobody knew what to say anymore. The Whispering Sword was the most notable heritage of the Sword Manor. According to the rule established by Supreme Lord Sword back then, if he died, the next master of the Sword Manor must acquire the Whispering Sword to open the gate of the Killing Sword Mountain. Only in this way could one officially inherit the Sword Manor and become the new master. Finch didn't have the Whispering Sword. He was just the acting leader. The Whispering Sword hadn't appeared for so many years. Nobody worried about it and had gradually forgot about it. No one questioned Finch as their leader. After all, Finch had made so many significant contributions to the development of the Sword Manor all these years. Now someone had suddenly showed up with the Whispering Sword. Everyone felt a rush of emotions at this scene. This was not the root of the problem. The biggest factor to consider was that the one who possessed the Whispering Sword was Zen. If an unknown warrior had taken the Whispering Sword to the Sword Manor and expressed a desire to inherit the Sword Manor, the elders of the Sword House would have immediately chucked the warrior out, or even killed him. But this was no ordinary warrior, it was Zen. So this was a different and slightly complex situation. The crisis of the world of chaos was approaching and no one could escape the imminent disaster. Warriors who had participated in the final battles at the illusion battlefield would take up the responsibility to help everyone go safely through this crisis of the universe. The crisis might come in 10 years, or in 100 years, and for the warriors in the universe, there wasn't too much time to prepare for it. If the top warrior of the illusion battlefield became their new master, it would benefit them a lot. It was this conflict that had everyone tongue-tied. Chapter 1392, The Gate. These people were not interested in Zen's strength, but the potential that he had in this world of chaos. After the battle in the illusion battlefield, all the major powers would train the ace talents and godly geniuses as their family's successors. In truth, many of the major powers had already made preparations for the world of chaos before its advent. The Sword Manor had selected 3 core talents for training. Among them, they had selected an ace talent. Unfortunately, the warrior had been eliminated at the second stage itself. Any power would definitely be willing to accept an unaffiliated godly genius like Zen. Now, he had suddenly made an appearance at the Sword Manor on his own with the old Manor Master's seal of Whispering Sword. Strictly speaking, this was a good thing for the Sword Manor. But at this point, the master of the Sword Manor was Finch. Currently, he was in charge of the Sword Manor, and while he was a righteous and benevolent person, people were selfish. He had managed the Sword Manor for so many years, and had always been extremely cautious and very diligent, but now a Spirit Supreme Realm kid had run over and was about to take over the Sword Manor with the old Manor Master's imprint. It was a difficult decision for anyone to take in a short period of time. The group of elders from the Sword House waited silently in anticipation for Finch's judgment. An uncomfortable silence and a palpable tension hung in the air at the Sword Heart Pavilion. Finch understood the concerns of these subordinates. Suddenly, his expression changed and a completely relaxed look appeared on his face. After mulling over it for a moment, he said, "I took over the position of the Manor Master only to fill in the vacancy and act as an agent for the old Manor Master to keep the manor functioning normally. According to the old Manor Master's command, the person with the seal of Whispering Sword was to become the Manor Master. Now that that person has appeared, I should follow the old Manor Master's orders and hand over the reins to him. However," he paused for a moment before continuing solemnly, "Zen doesn't seem to know the significance of the Whispering Sword seal. He only came here to hone his sword skills. Will he agree to our request? Or rather, the old Manor Master's request?" Obtaining Supreme Lord Sword's Whispering Sword seal meant getting responsibility of the enormous sword manor. This was an extremely prestigious matter. Any independent warrior would have been thrilled. But Zen was no ordinary warrior. He was the champion of the illusion battlefield as well as an independent warrior. Many sects would most likely do everything in their power to recruit him. The people from the Sword Manor didn't know much about Zen's experience. They assumed that he already belonged to some sect. "Humph, the lad has received Supreme Lord Sword's seal, so he has to agree even if he doesn't want to," said an elder sternly. "You're right, since he has brought the Whispering Sword seal with him, he will be the one to open that door. Does he really think he got Supreme Lord Word's seal just like that? He has a responsibility. Speaking of which, just because he possesses the Whispering Sword seal doesn't mean that he will automatically pass the inheritance trial unscathed. The Whispering Sword was just a key. Whether Zen would be able to pass the trial after opening that door was another matter entirely." Everyone in the Sword Manor knew that Supreme Lord Sword had been able to rise to prominence because of the Killing Sword Mountain. The origin of this mountain was a big secret even for Finch, and they had all entered the mountain to cultivate. Until now, they did not know why the Killing Sword Mountain held such an appeal to the swordsmen of the world who came from afar carrying their swords and entered the mountain to cultivate. When Finch finished, there was a hubbub among the martial artists of the Sword Heart Pavilion again. They wished that they could seize Zen right away and ask him for an explanation. Many people in the Sword Manor would probably have a sleepless night. The sudden appearance of an uninvited guest who would decide the future of the Sword Manor was a big deal and worth fretting over. Yet Zen was almost clueless about this entire ordeal. The next day, when Zen appeared, it wasn't just Finch and the other two who he had to face, but all of the elders of the Sword House who had convened to interrogate him. All eyes were on Zen. They were all sizing him up. Zen was the strongest of the younger generation in the universe, and his skills from the painting were still fresh in their minds. When Zen struck out with the Chaotic God's intimidating strike, relying on the instant godly tile, he had made an almost perfect sword strike leaving everyone in the Sword Manor awestruck. They couldn't believe that a mere Soul Sea Realm warrior could do that. Apart from the power of the sword attack, Zen's blow was made up of the power of the internal momentum in that instant. It was a perfect strike. It was like a work of art for the practitioners who were obsessed with cultivating the sword. The beaming spectators didn't have the words to describe that incredible scene. Standing in the presence of these powerful warriors who were only a half step away from world lords, Zen certainly felt the pressure. As for Freya, her scalp was tingling. She had seen many powerful entities with Zen. When the Supreme Lords had besieged the Fairy Palace, she could only hide to keep herself safe. So all the pressure was on Zen, and she did not feel too nervous. These people in front of her were considered important figures in the eyes of many forces. Their imposing manner alone was enough to intimidate her. "Zen, after you," Finch offered. He was actually keen on talking to Zen. However, he would wait until Zen had entered the Killing Sword Mountain with the Whispering Sword and had passed the trial. Only after Zen had acquired the inheritance of the old Manor Master fair and square would they be able to take the next step. If Zen came out of the Killing Sword Mountain empty-handed, then none of the conflicts would exist and there would be no need for the discussion. The group of people exited the huge sword structure and flew towards the north. As they continued northwards, the buildings below became more and more scattered. A lush and verdant primeval forest was visible to Zen. As they advanced, a mountain range appeared, and in the middle of the mountain range was a gigantic fissure. It looked like it had been created by the strike of a sword. This crack stretched on for who knew how many miles, with no end in sight. Finch led the way, floating down into the crevice. Zen and Freya followed close behind, with the elders from the sword house flying majestically behind them. Only a thin line of sky was visible from within the depth of the canyon. On both sides of the cliff, there were quite a few caves, which might be the lairs of some ferocious beasts. After sensing the aura of Zen's group, the fierce beasts lay dormant in their nests, not daring to come out rashly. During this period of time, a few reckless and less intelligent beasts showed up. One of them was a kind of brown worm. The elders of the sword house, who were behind Zen, unsheathed their long swords. Their sword rays sliced the beasts into pieces. The Killing Sword Mountain was the sacred place of the sword manor, and ordinary people did not have the right to enter it. Only those warriors who had gained a deep understanding of the way of sword had the chance to leave behind their sword, in the form of a soul. But how could a soul enter this mountain? Was Killing Sword Mountain a soul as well? Zen had already thought about these questions, but he had no answer. During their journey, he had inquired of Finch about these questions, who had pondered for a moment, shaking his head. I also entered the Killing Sword Mountain in the form of a soul, but I have never entered it in the form of a physical body before. Everyone present had entered the Killing Sword Mountain before, but they had not truly entered it. This was because there was only one way to open the door, and that was by using the Whispering Sword. As they continued onward, the gorge became narrower and narrower. In the end, it was only wide enough for one person to pass through at a time. Everyone else followed suit and flew in a line. After advancing a bit more, the canyon suddenly widened again. By now the thread of skylight had completely disappeared. Someone had taken out a glint pearl in order to provide some light. They had stepped into a huge cave. Grr! Just then, a low growl was heard, followed by the sound of chains shaking in the darkness not too far away from the group. Following the ray of light, two colossal creatures appeared in front of everyone. The two monsters lay prostrate on the ground. Their huge heads were covered with red spikes. They looked sinister and terrifying. At this moment, two monsters had already raised their heads. Their crimson eyes revealed hostility, as they glared at everyone like they were going to attack if anyone from the group took one more step forward. Freya's face instantly turned pale, and she couldn't help but cower behind Zen. "Don't be afraid," Zen said in a soft voice, assuming that since Finch had brought him here, these two vicious beasts shouldn't pose too much of a threat to them. "These are the baleful celestial hounds, the watchdogs of the Killing Sword Mountain," explained Finch. He then took out a red flute from his pocket and began playing it lightly. The baleful celestial hounds retreated when they heard the lively sound of the flute, and not far away, a huge door appeared. From the door came a strong malicious aura, as if a demon hound was sleeping at the door. Chapter 1393. Dig Through. Confusion was written all over Zen's face as he continued to walk. Why were they currently in this poorly lit place? They should be headed for the Killing Sword Mountain, not in this cave. Alas, there they were. He thought for a while. Maybe the Killing Sword Mountain was inside a cave. They stopped in front of a huge door that was bluish-gray in color, its surface carved with various exquisite patterns. A thin layer of dust had accumulated on the patterns, grooves and creases, as if it had been deserted for a very long time. Although Finch had never entered this giant door before, he was still very familiar with the surroundings outside. With a casual wave of his hand, a strong gust of wind blew past, and swept away all the dust. With the dirt out of the way, the patterns on the giant door were now fully visible. Zen saw what appeared to be a large spider carving, which seemed to have thousands of legs. Apparently, the patterns he saw before were the spider's textured legs. He was honestly surprised to see the patterns. Back when they had stepped foot inside the cave, a strange aura permeated the surroundings. Even the huge door emitted such a menacing aura as well. However, warriors who practiced sword skills were usually honest and moral, since immoral doings would affect their own sword hearts. Now, Supreme Lord Sword was probably the strongest swordsman in the universe, but why did he set up such a door? Zen couldn't help but feel something strange, but he gradually began to speculate. The supposedly mysterious Killing Sword Mountain was said to have many huge secrets. But if the present clues were any proof, Zen gained nothing from those secrets. Thus, Zen thought that the secret might have something to do with the fact that Supreme Lord Sword became a true god as well as the thing that Shania had mastered. "Zen, you can go in now." Finch pointed to the center of the gate, where the head of the spider sculpture was. According to the manor leader's instructions, those who carry the Whispering Sword need to put their arm into the mouth of this spider sculpture to open the door. Zen glanced at the vivid and almost realistic spider's head. A pair of compound eyes, which shone with a strange glow under the light of the glint pearl, seemed to be carved from the many precious stones. He felt that he was face to face with a real, thousand-legged spider and not a relief sculpture. After Zen nodded, he floated over to the spider's head and extended his arm inside it, while he simultaneously activated the sword-shaped mark on his arm. Crack! At that moment, it was like something had been triggered as the spider's mouth closed, and bit down on Zen's arm. Yet Zen didn't dodge because he thought that it was impossible for the bronze sculpture to pierce his skin. However, the sharp pain he felt in his arm suggested otherwise. It felt like a really sharp, pointed object punctured through his flesh, but he couldn't see it clearly because the mouth part was now closed. Regardless of what it was, it must be very special since it had easily pierced through his divine weapon body. Not forgetting his arm, Zen reacted instinctively as he brandished his other fist in an attempt to smash the sculpture into pieces. "Oh, no, stop it," Finch shrieked. He quickly stepped forward and stopped Zen's next move. This is the manor leader's way of identifying the whispering sword. "If this relief sculpture gets broken, I'm afraid that the door will never open," he said. Zen's lips curved down into a frown, but he suddenly felt that the sharp object had retracted itself from his arm. Just as he was trying to figure out what that was, the huge bronze door slowly creaked open with a loud sound. A strong, malicious aura from the Killing Sword Mountain immediately gushed out after, as if there was a vicious creature that lurked inside it. Everyone who was standing outside the door was affected by the malicious aura, especially Freya. She looked burdened as all the color was drained from her face. Bow wow! The two baleful celestial hounds that were previously quiet began to bark relentlessly, with occasional roars. This is the malicious aura from the Killing Sword Mountain. There was no doubt that the intense aura utterly shocked Zen. He had been to the Killing Sword Mountain twice before, but he knew that it was filled with such a bad aura. Also, he stored his own aura within it and prevented himself from being affected by the malicious aura. "The door has opened, only you can enter it," Finch said with a faint smile. A green rod then appeared in his hand, as a faint curtain of light diffused outwards and wrapped around Freya and the members of the Sword Manor. The light prevented them from being affected by the malicious aura. Without a second thought, Zen moved forward and entered the giant door. The door closed behind him with a loud creak the moment he went inside. Such a sound was quite ear-piercing in the empty environment. This was Zen's third time in the Killing Sword Mountain. This time, he was there with his physical body, which enabled him to feel all the strange things in the place. "I shouldn't have left Freya outside," Zen thought to himself. Ever since he had arrived at the Sword Manor, everything seemed to have gone smoothly. He thought back about his journey in the sword schools and the market, and his encounter with Caden. He found that everything had been quite easy. While there was nothing wrong with the behaviors of the members in the Sword Manor, Zen still felt a bit uneasy. However, he couldn't quite point out why. Since the door was closed already, it would be better to finish Supreme Lord Sword's test as soon as possible. He hoped that his emotion-closing godly way would become perfect. The final step to complete it was right in the Killing Sword Mountain, and he had no room to retreat. No wonder everything was so dark the last 2 times I entered the Killing Sword Mountain. The cave is indeed very dark. Not long after, the Killing Sword Mountain appeared in front of Zen. It wasn't actually quite tall. According to Zen's prediction, it should only be around 2,000 to 3,000 feet tall, which he honestly found quite small. Yet the closer he got to the Killing Sword Mountain, the more he felt that something was wrong. It was still the same mountain, but it was missing some key objects. The swords have disappeared. Back when Zen had competed with Roche in swordsmanship, he had only managed to enter the Killing Sword Mountain for the first time, after he had comprehended the consummate sword intent. The second time he entered was through the means of an illusion, created by Supreme Lord Sword. In both of those times, the Killing Sword Mountain had been covered with countless swords which were inserted from the foot of the mountain up to its apex. However, Zen had seen none of those swords now. Although he was confused, he kept moving and reached the mountain in no time due to his impressive speed. After he circled around the foot of the mountain, he followed the ridge and soon reached the mountaintop. Zen didn't find anything out of the ordinary from start to finish. It seemed that apart from this mountain, there was nothing else in the cave. Was this still the Killing Sword Mountain? Since Supreme Lord Sword had asked him to come here and temper his own swordsmanship in order to correct his final flaw in the emotion-closing godly way, there had to be something that he did not know about. As Zen floated on top of the mountain, he thought for a while, before he looked at the Killing Sword Mountain with raised eyebrows. The malicious aura. When Zen hadn't found anything on the mountain, there was an intense, murderous aura within the cave. The malicious aura turned out to be from inside the Killing Sword Mountain. Did that mean he had to go inside the Killing Sword Mountain? As Zen thought more of it, he didn't hesitate anymore. Swish, swish, swish. 3 rays of sword light intersected with each other, and formed a triangle on the mountain peak. He didn't use much power, and the sword light only reached about 10 feet below the mountain peak. Once that was done, Zen stabbed his sword to the side and with a slight budge, he pried out a piece of broken mountain rock from the mountain peak. The moment Zen pried it off, he felt a majestic, malicious aura burst forth from the gap he had made. he could almost see the red mist, which came along with a strange fragrance. The fragrance smelled very sweet even if it smelled like blood, but not too repulsive. Then, he discovered that the bottom half of the soft, clay-like soil was actually bright red in color. It looked like it was a mixture of blood and dirt. Just what is this Killing Sword Mountain? Zen asked, truly perplexed. His face twisted into a more serious expression. He launched 3 sword strikes, and then the 3 rays of sword light traveled downwards even further. Soon enough, the hole he had dug up started to cave in, and it seemed like he had successfully bored through the Killing Sword Mountain. Chapter 1394. A Spatial Maze Array. The Killing Sword Mountain was hollow. Right at the opening, Zen stood as he looked down. A deep, red light shone from inside the structure, hindering his view. In Zen's pupils, a jade-green light was shining. After his eyes had been cleansed by the sap from the divine tree, he could clearly see what was hidden over long distances away. But even after looking at it once more, he couldn't see it quite clearly. Although Zen had sensed a strange aura from within the cave since he entered, he didn't turn back. Without much thinking, he stepped into the opening and descended from the top of the Killing Sword Mountain. At this point, the man was bearing much pressure. The malicious aura coming from within the mountain was so thick that it seemed nearly solid. At a glance, it looked like some kind of red mist in strange shapes, as if there were all sorts of demons and ghosts circling around Zen. Strange cries came from them as well. When Zen tried to listen more carefully, the sounds faded away as if they were mere illusions. Whoosh! Suddenly, he felt a black shadow pass over his head. What is it? Instantly, he turned alert. Although he was undoubtedly a bold, courageous man, he had just reached the Spirit Supreme realm, he wasn't invincible. When he lifted his head to see what the black shadow was, he sent his senses outward to scan the area. But the rich malicious aura from the cave was affecting his perception. Perhaps he truly was hallucinating, immersed in the malicious aura. The atmosphere felt too dense. If he stayed there for too long, he feared there would be unpredictable consequences. With this thought, he decided to speed up. And soon, he landed on the ground. The Killing Sword Mountain was located in the belly of a mountain range and Zen was right in its core. One could imagine the pressure he felt. Just as he reached the ground, he heard a panting sound. Puff, puff. When Zen turned around, there was no one there. The area was still thick with a blood-red malicious aura. With the Thunderwind divine sword in his grasp, he chose a direction and continued on forward. But after taking only 2 steps, he heard the panting once again. Puff. The moment he heard it, Zen turned right around and suddenly thrust his sword forward. Disturbed by the sword light, the malicious aura around him started churning like a demon. Whoosh! When the sword light shot out, it submerged into the endless malicious aura, hitting nothing. Skeptical, Zen narrowed his eyes and continued walking forward with his sword in hand. Having already reached such a depth, he had no more reason to retreat. He could only become more vigilant and keep walking forward. But the doubt in his heart grew stronger. Could it be that this was part of the examination for the emotion-closing godly way? When Zen pondered on it, it didn't seem right. If it was simply to hone his swordsmanship, there was no need for him to enter such a strange place. Supreme Lord Sword must have asked him to come here for some bigger reason. As he continued forward, Zen spotted a tombstone standing stark naked on the side of the path. It seemed very out of place. Approaching it, Zen examined the tombstone. There were no letters carved into it. Just who was resting underneath it. Sure that it had nothing to do with his journey, Zen turned and walked onward. But soon after, he saw another tombstone just like it, bare, without words. Proceeding forward, he saw a third one. At that point, Zen realized that something was wrong. Before passing by the tombstone, he tapped his finger lightly. Then, a thin wind blade hit the top of the tombstone, leaving a small mark. When the 4th tombstone appeared, Zen checked the surface. It's the same one, he murmured, spotting the mark he had made before. And then he was certain that he had been circling the tombstone all this time. Martial artists that cultivated in the space law were extremely sensitive to space. Normal people would get lost in the fog because of how difficult it was to determine their position. But Zen would not. He was well aware that he was walking in a straight line. There was absolutely no deviation. But even so, he kept returning to his starting point. Some kind of force was keeping him trapped in a loop. What a clever method. Zen praised the trap inwardly as he stood in front of the tombstone. Once one cultivated the space law to a higher level, they were able to connect 2 spaces. And Zen could do so as he traveled through space. But once space shifted, it emitted fluctuations of the space law right where the first space was connected to the second. This was something Zen didn't sense here. Considering this, Zen realized that the one who created this spatial maze array was definitely strong when it came to the space law. Because 4 tombstones came into Zen's sight, he knew that he had wandered the same area 4 times already. After a moment, Zen kicked off the ground with his feet and sped away, keeping closely above the ground. Whoosh! His speed was remarkable as he glided across the surface. The 5th tombstone, the 6th tombstone. Seeing a tombstone meant that Zen had passed through a spatial node and was teleported back to where he started. Judging from his speed, he estimated that the spatial maze array was about 8,000 feet long. But knowing the scope of the area didn't make it any easier for Zen to leave, not unless he cultivated the space law to an even higher level. The malicious aura is becoming increasingly thick. Haven't you noticed? All of a sudden, Lavender's slender figure gradually condensed right before Zen's eyes. Her eyes flickered as she examined her surroundings. This looks like a trap. A trap? Zen asked, still stunned. Though he wasn't exactly surprised, he didn't see any reason why Supreme Lord Sword would deceive him from afar to such an extent. Staring at Zen, Lavender smiled coldly. She could tell what he was thinking. Pointing up, she said, "If you don't believe me, just look for yourself." Following her finger, Zen looked up and was shocked to see a large, blood-red face staring at him with a pair of empty eyes. These eyes didn't have the slightest hint of life, and that expression wasn't something any human should be able to make. While he had seen vengeful spirits in the past, Zen had never felt something as chilling. So Zen raised his hand and slashed the face with the Thunderwind Divine Sword. No matter what it was, he had to kill it first, he thought. Swoosh! Perhaps it was because Zen had lost his patience that he used the god's intimidating strike right away. If this sword light pierced through it, it could probably split the Killing Sword Mountain apart. It might even be able to penetrate the mountain from outside. But Zen had underestimated the spatial maze array, or rather, he had underestimated the Killing Sword Mountain itself. If it was so easy to destroy, who could the sacred place stop, relying on the bronze door? If that were the case, any warrior at the Spirit Supreme Realm could easily force their way in. But the secrets of the Killing Sword Mountain were far beyond Zen's imagination. The sword light faded away as though it had sunken into an endless space, disappearing without a trace. The large, blood-red face was split into 2 by his sword, but it quickly merged back into one and slowly approached the ground. Just then, Zen discovered that apart from the top of his head, there were faces that made people's hair stand on end appearing in every direction, approaching Zen. "Give me the spear," Lavender said. With a flick of Zen's finger, the saint-killing spear shot out from his space ring, falling into Lavender's hand. Whoosh! Shadowy spin. Lavender's spear strike was sharper than Zen's sword strike, but it didn't seem to be of much use. From the attack, only a large hole was bored through the blood-red face. It didn't suffer any significant damage. "Use thunder," Lavender instructed firmly. Then, a sliver arc as thick as a wrist shot out of the Thunderwind Divine Sword. Pa! Thunder and lightning were evil's natural enemies. The lightning shot out suddenly and struck one of the huge faces. The massive face then began to sway. It looked pained under the constant swaying in the air as it emitted a terrifying roar. Chapter 1395, A Black Shadow. The deafening roar reverberated through the air around the Killing Sword Mountain like an evil spirit. It seemed like the huge faces were no different from evil spirits. If Zen was facing this alone, he would have definitely been terrified. But as Lavender was with him, Zen felt more confident. After all, 2 people were always better than 1, even though her presence was just spiritual. As he realized that lightning somehow had an effect on these giant faces, Zen decided he needed to deal lightning damage to them. The Thunderwind Divine Sword contained 3 kinds of sword techniques. Aside from the Nether God Shadow, it could also produce wind blades and lightning. Zen poured his chaotic energy into the sword. Countless shadow whips were formed from it, and they lashed crazily at the gigantic faces in the air. Pock, 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 pock. The enormous face nearest to Zen suffered the most damage from the strikes of lightning, and was finally dissipated into a cloud of malicious aura. This scene bolstered Zen's confidence even further. The only thing that worried him at the start was that he didn't know if these faces could be affected by anything. Since he had already seen that they could be destroyed by lightning, then defeating them wouldn't be hard. The faces were floating towards him at a very slow pace. Even though they were numerous, Zen had a lot of time on his hands. After just a couple of minutes, all the huge faces surrounding Zen had been eliminated. That was great. Zen breathed out a sigh of relief. A look of tranquility passed on his face. Now, I can focus on finding a way out of here. As soon as he finished the sentence, he noticed that Lavender was looking at him in a strange way. Then he realized that her gaze was not directed at him, but at something directly behind him. Ahem, ahem. Zen immediately turned around and saw a huge head with a gaping mouth, which had attempted to take a bite out of him. The head's facial features were similar to those of the giant faces that had attacked him before, but when they were compared, the giant faces seemed like they were made as masks for the head, as if the head was the original. Whoosh! Before the bite landed on his skin, Zen shifted and evaded instinctively using the 8 smoky melodies. Simultaneous with his retreat, a long whip of lightning slithered out of the Thunderwind divine sword and continued to thrash the head. The way that those strange eyes stared at him gave him a weird feeling. Zen had expected from the start that lightning would still be effective in dealing with this as it always did. However, the tenacity of this head eluded his understanding. Or maybe, this thing was not susceptible to lightning at all. Not only was it resistant to lightning damage, its movement speed was also quicker than the huge faces from earlier. Let's go. When Lavender thrust her spear at the head, the spear shadow pierced a huge hole through it. The spear had the ability to destroy everything, but it failed to destroy the head. After a large hole was pierced on it, its face contorted into an even more horrible grimace, which only added to its terrible appearance. As Zen proceeded forward rapidly, he caught sight of another gigantic head coming towards him from the left side. He could also see some faint red shadows originating from the red mist of the malicious aura nearby. It was probably more of these gigantic heads. It seemed that these things were originally concealed within the malevolent aura of the Killing Sword Mountain. It was Zen who made them reveal themselves. Zen couldn't think of any reason why these things had been hidden in the Killing Sword Mountain. Could it be that the malicious aura was too strong and finally coalesced into these forms of malicious aura? Originally, countless swords were embedded into the Killing Sword Mountain, and many warriors left their malicious aura into the mountain. As the malicious aura accumulated, it was possible for this kind of phenomenon to occur. Given this premise, it was highly probable, but how could it explain what was going on with the tombstone? What was going on with the spatial maze array? Zen could not think straight. This time, he was afraid that he had gotten into real trouble. After circling around the area a few times, Zen once again found himself at the starting point. Another tombstone appeared in front of him. The spatial maze array wasn't dangerous, but more and more gigantic heads were being materialized. They started to crowd against one another, almost formed into a wall, and pushed towards Zen. Things were really unusual in this place. Although Zen's physical body was strong, it wasn't of any help in terms of destroying these heads. What he needed to do the most was still break the spatial maze array. However, when he saw the walls formed by the giant heads that were approaching him, Zen knew that he didn't stand a chance. Right at that moment, a dark shadow suddenly rushed past from the side. Looking closely, Zen observed that the black shadow moved with an unusual agility, as if it was a black cat or something similar. However, he knew that a normal cat or dog would not be able to survive in that place, nor have such incredible speed. It might be some kind of small ferocious beast. Follow it, Lavender reminded him. Zen was already on the move even before she told him to. He knew he would be in big trouble if he did not leave this place soon. He wasn't able to find any clues to help him break through the spatial maze array. Zen did not know the importance of the black shadow's appearance at that moment, but it would be a wise choice to follow it for now. Whoosh! The black shadow moved forward continuously hidden within the malicious aura. Even though Zen was focusing all his efforts at following it, he had a really hard time discerning it from the darkness surrounding it. The shadow had 4 slender legs. Its running speed was almost equal to Zen's as he flew close to the ground. The most remarkable thing was that the black shadow ran not in a straight line, but in a zigzag pattern. It was fortunate that Zen had decided to use the 8 smoky melodies, which was an incredibly tricky movement technique to begin with, so he was barely able to keep up with this black shadow. Zen lost track of time while rushing forward following the black shadow. He astonishingly realized that the scenery around him seemed to be different. He finally confirmed that he had escaped the spatial maze array when the tombstone was nowhere to be seen. "We are out of the spatial maze array." Zen laughed. "Don't celebrate too soon," Lavender said without expression. Zen's movement speed slowed down after he left the spatial maze array. At the same time, he also noticed that the black shadow's speed was decreased significantly. "It's strange, huh?" Lavender asked. Zen nodded his agreement, his expression becoming serious again. This black shadow strangely seemed to be intentionally guiding him forward. "I wonder where this thing is taking me," he thought to himself. The intricacy of the situation in the Killing Sword Mountain baffled Zen's mind. The black shadow might be leading him intentionally to a more desperate situation, so he was wary of being in dire trouble. Is this black shadow really leading me forward to help me? Where does it want to lead me to? Just as these thoughts crossed his mind, Zen pulled to a stop. Likewise, the black shadow also stopped in its tracks, about 100 feet away from him. It seemed to turn its head back to look at him. With the thick malicious aura separating them, Zen wasn't able to clearly see what the black shadow's form was. But he definitely saw a pair of shiny green eyes staring back at him on the head of the black shadow, scaring him a little bit. He felt a sudden impulse to kill the black shadow immediately, but he wasn't able to because of its speed. Zen stood in confrontation with the black shadow for a while. He really needed to have at least an inkling of what the black shadow's intention was. Thus, Zen began to gather strength in his legs. If he wanted to catch this thing, he planned to take it by surprise. Angling himself slightly forward, he suddenly unleashed his potential as he sprinted towards the black shadow. But at the same time he dashed towards it, the black shadow pulled away from him with an incredible speed. This reaction speed was extraordinarily fast. Chapter 1396. The Faces and the Murals. Zen was like an arrow that left the bow swiftly as he dashed forward at an astonishing speed. The speed of the shadow wasn't slow, either, as its malicious aura disappeared in no time. It appeared to turn around and concurrently speed forward. But it seemed that their distance never got close. It was as if this black shadow had trained in 8 smoky melodies too. It was able to maintain the distance between the two of them at around 100 feet. Zen refused to believe this. The principle of the 8 smoky melodies made it nearly impossible for the distance to be that far. The space between them could have been 3 inches, 5 inches, or even more, but it could never be 10 feet. One in front and the other flying behind, the surrounding terrain also underwent a change. Round holes that were about 3 feet wide continuously appeared in the ground as malicious aura continued to surge out from them, making them look like geysers. Only, what came from these holes was not spring water but malicious aura. This malicious aura became increasingly thick until one could only see what was in front of them. Sadly, Zen was unable to lock onto the black shadow in this environment and lost its track quickly. I lost it, Zen said, stopping. As she floated behind Zen, Lavender keenly surveyed the surroundings and said with a face full of shock, I never thought that the Killing Sword Mountain would have such a peculiar sight. How was it created? Though seeing the scene made Lavender a bit puzzled, her profound knowledge was more in-depth than that of Zen. Pop, 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 the balls of malicious aura looked as if they were being spat out by the behemoths. For quite a time, Zen had been submerged in the Killing Sword Mountain. And now, he was affected by the malicious aura as a restless feeling arose within his heart. Still not right. This malicious aura is coming from deep underground. Unable to find the shadow, Zen landed next to a hole, and taking advantage of the interval, looked down inside. Much to his surprise, Zen vividly saw a face. To be more accurate, it was not a human face, but one that looked like that of a fiend from the abyss with a pair of fangs covering its upper lip. The eyes in that face were tightly shut, as if they were lifeless. Not long after, it suddenly opened its mouth. Zen quickly retracted his head, and a thick pillar of malicious aura spurted out from the hole. What did you see? A perplexed expression plastered on Lavender's face. Zen silently pointed at the hole with a strange expression. Soon after the pillar of air stopped, Lavender also looked inside the hole. With a single glance, her face also underwent a drastic change. Lavender possessed a sword spirit body, so naturally, she wouldn't turn deathly pale like a real person. However, Zen could discern fear in her eyes. This kind of expression rarely appeared on Lavender's face since she was incredibly decisive when it came to her fighting skills, especially her killing way. And that decisiveness was one of her attributes that could resist any form of fear arising from within her heart. Zen knew there was something unusual. How is this possible? Lavender muttered, looking more confused than ever before, sweeping her gaze around. Are these holes full of this thing? Zen glanced into another hole and confirmed, it seems so. What are these things? Lavender contemplated for a while before pursing her lips. Shaking her head, she muttered, I've only seen it once, and there should only be one of them. Why are there so many of them hidden at the bottom of the Killing Sword Mountain? Could it be that it has something to do with the calamity of the world of chaos? What is it? Zen's curiosity was piqued. Not now, Lavender went on, shaking her head as she stared at Zen. Lavender was so straightforward ever since they were together. She had been brutally honest with Zen and never concealed anything from him. What are all these things? Why can't she tell me? Zen thought, staring at Lavender in a baffled state. He felt that since his return from the illusion battlefield, her temperament seemed to have changed, becoming more real, but at the same time, she was even colder towards him. Let's keep going. Lavender clearly understood what Zen had in mind, but she didn't want to explain. Zen inwardly sighed as he had no choice but to continue cautiously exploring this area. He slowly inched his way to avoid the pillars of malicious aura that was spewing out of the holes. Not long after he started moving forward, Zen eventually discovered some specifics hidden in the depths of the Killing Sword Mountain. There was a cyan hall with two strange statues standing at the entrance. The heads of both statues that resembled goats were carved with incomparable malevolence. It was unknown what race's culture it was, but it was definitely not human. Silently sauntering towards the statues, Zen couldn't believe his eyes as he inspected them. He marveled at the smoothness of their surfaces against the tips of his fingers as he gently and leisurely stroked them. Though he knew nothing about their material compositions and how long they had stood there, he concluded that the sculptures were extraordinarily exquisite since they had no signs of any decay. Looking up, Zen found the hall was in total darkness, like the big, open mouth of a monster lying on its stomach, quietly waiting for him. Zen didn't hesitate to take his initial step as he tightened his grip on the Thunderwind Divine Sword. For Zen, all these fears came from the fluctuations of one's state of mind. Since he had already found this place, there was no reason for him to turn back. Whatever inside, he was resolute in finding out. After Zen and Lavender entered, a figure slowly appeared outside the hall. Underneath this figure's feet, there was a black shadow crawling on the ground, whose pair of green eyes was very eye-catching against the darkness. That figure had only appeared briefly, and upon seeing Zen move toward the main hall, they had soundlessly concealed themselves in a corner. As Zen walked within the hall, the malicious aura in the air seemed to have become less intense, and it also went with the restless feeling it had stirred up earlier on. Even so, Zen detected that the hall was darkened with a slight trace of malicious aura. Though he activated his magical vision, it didn't get much better. He had no choice but to take out a glint pearl to light up the place. There is dark law here to prevent light from passing through, Lavender reminded him from behind. Zen slightly nodded. While holding the glint pearl in his hand, he got nearer to one side of the hall. A large mural stopped him in his tracks when the light hit the wall before him. The mural was magnificently carved into the wall, seemingly made of the same material components as the statues outside. Zen didn't know how long it had been in existence, but the details were so vivid and lifelike. This is. Zen leaned in close. He focused his gaze on the contents of the mural. There were numerous strange-looking creatures carved in the mural, and they came in different sizes, some were big, and some were small. A lot of them were unknown to him, but to his surprise, Zen had recognized the largest one. He had seen this big beast before when he entered the blood-red castle during the second stage of the illusion battlefield. It was the gigantic beast statue standing at the entrance of the castle. In the mural, the gigantic beast was like a large ship. It opened its mouth and made a sucking motion, wanting to swallow the other countless creatures in the mural. Zen looked ahead and continued strolling forward when a second mural appeared. The creatures in the second mural seemed to be resisting with all their might. It was as if they wanted to kill this enormous beast. In the third mural, however, Zen noted that only the beast was present, while the other creatures had all disappeared. The murals were not difficult to read. It only implied that there were a lot of creatures resisting the gigantic beast. In the end, however, they failed and were recorded in the murals. These creatures must be real, judging from the lifelike carvings of the giant beast. However, after careful examination, Zen did not find a single human among them. There was not a single human-shaped creature. In the present universe, many intelligent beings had great ties with humans. They were ogres, demon knight, giants, and so on. They all possessed 4 limbs, a head, and a torso. However, the creatures in the murals were extremely bizarre in appearance, even more bizarre than some of the beasts. This hall, in particular, wasn't constructed by humans. Why was it hiding here? Zen was deeply puzzled. He found himself having a hard time explaining and grasping even a single strange thing that he had seen right after he entered the Killing Sword Mountain. Lavender, on the other hand, clearly knew something, but she chose not to answer his question. Contemplating deeply this, Zen halted his steps in the darkness and opted to communicate with the Cyan Dragon in his mind. Cyan Dragon, do you know what place this is? He asked. Cyan Dragon had been quiet along the way. He did not utter a word when he encountered so many things. It was clear that he knew something. Chapter 1397, The Dark Room. The Cyan Dragon did not reply. Zen took his silence to heart and felt very depressed. What was behind all these things? He knew that the answers weren't going to just present themselves on a silver platter for him, so he thought it best to explore by himself. He decided to continue on with the glint pearl. Except for the murals, there didn't seem to be anything else special about the hall. Zen soon arrived at a room at the back of the hall. There was a cracking noise as soon as he entered. It seemed he had stepped upon something. He looked down at his feet and saw a cloud of dust rise. Zen lowered the glint pearl and saw exactly what he stepped on. It was a skeleton, a human skeleton. This skeleton must have been here for so long that it turned to dust the moment someone stepped on it. He continued looking around, his gaze flickering under the light. There was more than one skeleton here. Numerous bones were scattered all over the place. Some were still complete, meaning that the corpses remained intact. Or it could also mean that all these people died here. A person's body decomposed at a rate determined by the cultivation level. Those who entered the Killing Sword Mountain definitely had high cultivation levels, since normal warriors would never be able to withstand the overwhelming killing aura along the way. After death, the skeletons of those who had been at the Soul Sea realm and above would turn into bone jade and last for a very long time. However, bone jade did not last forever. Given enough time, the spiritual energy within the bone jade would drain completely, and the bone jade would start its degradation process. This took tens, even hundreds of thousands of years though. For these bones to immediately crumble under Zen's weight meant that these corpses had been lying here for a very long time. Whoosh! Not wanting to crush any more bones, Zen opted to float 2 inches above the ground. This room wasn't very big. In fact, it was only around 50 to 60 feet wide. He circled around and found no windows, only a pile of skeletons. There was nothing meaningful in here. His lack of discovery puzzled Zen. He had finally entered the Killing Sword Mountain, but there seemed to be nothing here. That couldn't be right. Besides, he wasn't willing to leave this place empty-handed. Zen expected a trial, a challenge to test his skills. After the said challenge, he would then master the most important part of the emotion-closing godly way and become a fully fledged godly genius. It was all supposed to be simple and straightforward. This was the opposite of his expectations. He had gained nothing. Check the center of the skeletons, Lavender said. She floated beside him and pointed the saint-killing spear down to where the bones were. Zen looked and found what seemed to be a disc hiding underneath all the piled-up skeletons. The disc was the same color as the ground, making it extremely easy to miss. He smiled at Lavender. Thank you, you're welcome. Zen's heart skipped a beat as he heard her cold answer. This feeling of estrangement made him very unhappy. He really wanted to know what happened to her. Who did she talk to when he had been away in the illusion battlefield? It would have been difficult and close to impossible for her to have communicated with anyone in the fairy palace. She also couldn't have left since the authority to enter and exit the place was in Zen's hands. Freya was also simple, almost like a child, so Lavender would not have chatted with her. Livingston was deeply immersed in weapon refining, so it also couldn't have been him. Could it be the Cyan Dragon? When Zen entered the illusion battlefield and was locked inside that beam of light, Lavender would have been able to talk to the Cyan Dragon. The Cyan Dragon had kept silent just now. Did he say something to Lavender? Zen fully trusted the two of them, but it seemed they were currently hiding something from him. He decided to just set aside his doubts for now. The first thing on his agenda was to find out what was underneath this room. Clearing away the bones, Zen stepped onto the disc. There was an echoing thump and sure enough, it was empty below the disc. A surge of power gathered at the joints of his forefinger and the surface of the disc suddenly shattered. It had been unable to withstand his weight, so he ended up falling down. Fortunately, he was able to stabilize his body. He was now inside a dark room. The glint pearl would be extremely useful in illuminating the darkness of this hole Zen had fallen in. However, the moment he threw it out, the glint pearl immediately disappeared from sight. That shouldn't have happened. The glint pearl was an object that could emit light for a very long time. The moment Zen threw it, it should have illuminated the place it fell to. He heard a bang, so it must have fallen onto the floor. Where was it then? Zen could no longer see where it exactly went. This could only mean one thing. There was an intense dark glow in the room that completely blocked out all light. Zen tried using his magic vision, but not even that could let him see what was below. It was entirely pitch black. Lavender simply floated beside him and did not give any suggestions. Gritting his teeth, he figured that there was only one way to find out what was inside the room. He had to go there himself. With a flip, Zen found himself inside the dark room. He truly couldn't see anything, not even his hand that he held up his face. The light above him had since disappeared. He was in absolute, total darkness. Zen was extremely alert. The Thunderwind Divine Sword had already been infused with chaotic energy. Any movement within the vicinity would be met with his quick counterattack. He stood extremely still for a while, however, there was nothing. Other than his own breathing, there was only silence. Lavender, where are you? He called out. I'm here, her voice said beside him. Lavender had followed him and, judging from the sound of her voice, she was only right beside him. Can you see anything? He asked. No, there must be something here that releases the dark law, Lavender replied. Zen nodded but quickly realized that she probably couldn't see him. I see, he answered, slowly walking forward in the darkness. An unseen enemy was truly the most troublesome opponent to deal with. Zen had already felt something wrong ever since he entered the Killing Sword Mountain. It was as if someone was following him but he did not know who or what it was. He took exactly 13 steps in the dark. The silence had him memorize each one. At the first sign of trouble, he would immediately leave this extremely dark room and return to the disc as soon as possible. He was confident in his own strength but it was hard to be rash in an extremely strange place. He had no idea what horrors awaited him in the darkness. It was after taking 30 steps that Zen finally heard a sizzling sound. Was that right? Did he imagine it? Zen extended his ears and he could indeed hear a sound similar to claws scratching the ground. Something is coming, he said. Zen squinted his eyes before closing them completely. He couldn't see anything and opening his eyes might create an illusion. With his eyes closed, he released his perception and felt the movements around him. At least, that was what was supposed to happen. The moment Zen released his perception, an invisible wall seemed to constrain him and blocked it. My perception is blocked, Zen cursed. The sizzling sound now grew louder and ever closer. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. He thrust out his sword several times in a moment of desperation. The sword radiance should have been blinding but because of the dark law, all light was just immediately absorbed by the darkness. What made it worse was that each slash of his sword was the sound of something getting hit. Clang, clang, clang. The sounds seemed to be a couple of extremely sharp forces that flew in from all directions, but all of them were bounced back. What were the walls of this dark room made of? It would be pointless to ask that since Zen couldn't see anything. All he knew was that if any of those sword strikes hit him instead, it would spell big trouble for him. He quietly activated the 8 smoky melodies as a precaution and stood still. Randomly dodging wasn't going to be an option. That would be even more dangerous since he couldn't see. All Zen could do was strain his senses to try and dodge the sword beams based on the surrounding energy fluctuations. However, this technique wasn't going to be practical in the long run. If the sword radiance was directed at his face, then he wouldn't be able to dodge it with the current level of his 8 smoky melodies. A direct hit would break through the 3-inch boundary very easily. He could only resign himself to his fate. Fortunately, his fate was extremely lucky. Chapter 1398, Spiders. The situation in the dark room turned chaotic all of a sudden. Some unknown creatures were approaching them. The creatures were unable to avoid Zen's sword radiance. When they got penetrated by it, they let out ear-piercing hisses. Lavender too launched an attack and at the same time, the sound of light footsteps came from not too far away. Then Zen heard Lavender's delicate voice. It sounded as if she was fighting with someone in the dark. Bang, bang. In all this chaos, Zen slipped and started falling down rapidly. Zen was struggling to stabilize his body when he felt a powerful force catch him and pull him to one side. Soon after, several threads draped his body. He struggled against the extremely soft and flexible threads. Clang! The thunder and lightning began to accumulate on the Thunder Wind Divine Sword, but it was instantly repelled by something. With a clang, the sword fell to the ground. Only after the dark law lifted partially did Zen discover that he was lying on a huge spider web. The threads forming the web looked like they had been spun delicately from gold. He was bound by many threads, which firmly locked him in place. Not too far away, there was a hexagonal seal. Lavender was ensconced within the seal. She was still holding onto her spear. Suddenly something dawned on him at that moment. Had he fallen into a trap? He twisted his body with a sudden jerk, wanting to break free from the golden spider web. However, it did not have much effect on this kind of a flexible spider web, which molded and moved in sync with his body movements. Of course, it could also be that Zen was not strong enough. He was mightier compared to other warriors at the same cultivation level, but when facing really powerful masters, his strength was still inadequate. As he continued to squirm and wriggle, the number of golden spider threads multiplied, binding Zen tighter to the web. Lavender's expression was uncharacteristically calm as she sat holding the saint-killing spear in her hand. Her composed manner gave Zen the heebie-jeebies. Pa, pa, pa. At this moment, footsteps could be heard once again. Zen looked towards the direction in which the sound came and saw a black figure. There was a small black shadow on the person's shoulder. The person's jade green eyes emitted an uncomfortable light. When the figure approached, Zen furrowed his brows and said coldly, "Master Bai." Finch Bai seemed to have become a completely different person. He simply chuckled in response when he heard Zen's voice. "Where's Freya?" Zen asked with a frown. "She's dead," Finch answered flatly. Huff, huff. An enraged flame rose in Zen's heart as an enormous aura burst forth from within his body. He had been on guard with the sword manner right from the beginning. Before he entered the Killing Sword Mountain, Zen had been hesitant about bringing Freya with him. However, Finch had repeatedly emphasized the rule that he had to enter the Killing Sword Mountain alone. That was why he had left Freya behind. "Don't worry, he is lying to you," Lavender said calmly. "He won't kill Freya in front of his subordinates, not to mention she isn't important to him, and he won't bother dealing with her specially." Hearing Lavender's words, Zen calmed down a bit. Finch had a smile on his face. "You are indeed still too young. I've already said this before. Letting a group of children lead the way is simply ridiculous." Whether it was Nathan or Zen, these godly geniuses were indeed outstanding. However, in the eyes of these world lords, who had lived for countless years, they were undoubtedly children, too young and inexperienced. However, Lavender replied indifferently, "It is not your fate to lead the way. Even if you're a supreme lord, you still don't have such a fate." "I don't believe in fate," Finch said as he strolled up towards them. From beneath his feet, golden threads began to appear. These threads wove into layers of steps, and he briskly walked up. "Even if it isn't my destiny right now, I will have it in a while," Finch added arrogantly. "Roar!" The black shadow on his shoulder raised its head and let out a loud cry. It was only then that Zen saw clearly that it was a pure black leopard. However, it was no ordinary creature. It looked like an extremely formidable beast. The black shadow that Zen had been chasing before must have been this same leopard, which wasn't any bigger than a cat. "What are you trying to do?" Zen asked angrily. "Can't you see? I've been waiting for this for a long time," Finch smiled in a sinister way. With a casual wave of his hand, the dark law, which wasn't far away, began to fade away. A ring appeared from within the darkness. He reached out and pulled the ring out from the air. The instant he grabbed the ring, a loud rumbling sound came from the darkness in the distance, as if countless boulders were rolling. The dark law disappeared completely without a trace, and what appeared before Zen was a vast expanse of space. In the distance, there were some slender objects that resembled dried fish. They were all suspended in the air by golden threads. The strange things had red skin, and their hands and feet were incongruous with their bodies. Golden threads were bound around their necks and their heads were stuffed into caves. These things might be the monsters that Zen had encountered earlier. He had seen their faces in small caves. "You want to usurp Supreme Lord Sword's inheritance on my behalf." Zen wasn't an idiot, he finally understood why Finch was present here. Finch waited until the stone pillars stopped before pulling another stone column. Then, there was a rumbling sound, as though there were countless mechanisms hidden in this space. As he was busy setting something, Finch replied, "It's obvious. There are some things that should not be done by you." Zen's eyebrows rose slightly. What exactly was the inheritance of Supreme Lord Sword? What Zen thought earlier was that it was only a trial, but now it seemed that the situation wasn't as simple as he'd thought. Even Lavender had acted very strange. There seemed to be a very significant meaning attached to this journey. But whether or not it was important, it had nothing to do with his goal, which was to complete his emotion-closing godly way. Locked in the hexagonal seal, Lavender sneered. She shook her head and said, "It's not that Zen is naive, it's you who is naive. There are some things that exist even if you don't believe in them. You're just a small character, and you can't change anything." Whoosh! The moment Lavender spoke, an extremely sharp sword radiance shot out from Finch's hand. He had actually used his finger as a sword, but still, the power was also extremely terrifying. In the end, he had the cultivation level of a Grand World Lord's. If this sword radiance landed on Zen, there was no way he could survive it. However, the sword radiance did not attack Zen. Instead, it went straight for Lavender, who was still inside the hexagonal seal. As the sword radiance cut through the air, it sliced off Lavender's arm from its root. Her severed arm turned into bits of red light before condensing into an arm again. Lavender was a sword spirit form, so she was not hurt too much, but her face didn't look good. If Finch wanted to, he could completely obliterate Lavender's soul. After the recovery of her soul, her strength had increased a great deal, but she was still unable to contend against a world lord. Not to mention that Finch's strength was comparable to that of a Grand World Lord. Finch smiled wickedly. Whether I have it or not is something that I will know only after trying. Moreover, I have been studying this place for countless years in anticipation of this very day. There is no omission in my arrangement, so I know that I won't fail. Lavender did not utter a word. She only glared at Finch icily. Zen also realized what was going on. Finch was well aware that the inheritance of Supreme Lord Sword was located right below the Killing Sword Mountain. At the same time, it was not his first time in the Killing Sword Mountain. It was obvious that he had disobeyed Sword Chen's orders long ago. Now he planned to obtain the inheritance of Sword Chen. But from the looks of it, the inheritance was not merely a trial, otherwise Finch would not have placed so much importance on it. So then what was it? Lavender seemed to know something, but she was not telling him. Zen was glum. All he could do was stay and watch as Finch busied himself in setting the place. Soon sizzling sounds filled the air. After Finch activated some mechanism, he heard something crawling once again. But this time, the sound was denser. It was as if there were countless small creatures crawling in all directions. Soon, Zen saw an astonishing scene. A large army of small spiders appeared from the cracks in the surrounding space. These spiders were dark red in color. A sea of spiders were surging towards Zen. Chapter 1399, The Corpse. Zen was annoyed when he saw the mass of densely packed small spiders that spread like a bloody ocean towards him. He had faced a myriad of difficulties in the past, but he had never been so passive. Being caught off his guard while he fell into this particular World Lord's trap irritated Zen to no end. The only thing that comforted him was Lavender. Although Lavender did not tell Zen what was in her mind, he could tell from her attitude that Finch's trick did not impress her. Finch also seemed to be wary of these small spiders. As he saw them spread out, he tapped his finger gently and dark red flames encircled him, enveloping his entire body. The wave of spiders ebbed like the tide as they climbed up the folds of Zen's clothing. Zen looked at the fist-sized crimson spiders with distrust. There was a low probability that the spiders were harmful to him, and Zen himself was not afraid of being poisoned. Why did they gather beside him? While he was still lost in his thoughts, the small spiders climbed onto his body and sunk their sharp mouthparts into his skin. Zen did not expect that the spiders' mouthparts were actually strong and powerful. His divine weapon body was not able to fight the attack, and the mouthparts embedded themselves deeply into his skin. The small spiders' bloated bodies deflated instantly, and then detached themselves from Zen before tumbling down to the ground. Surprisingly, they were actually dead. All of the spiders did the same thing. They attached themselves onto Zen's body, and seemed to inject a substance into him from their own abdomen, before they detached themselves and fell down dead. Zen observed his body for any changes, but he did not feel anything unusual. It baffled him. If these small spiders had injected him with poisonous venom, they wouldn't have died immediately. Why did that happen? The process had lasted for about 6 hours. The number of small spiders crawling up Zen like a tide earlier had decreased. The spider corpses, on the other hand, had already piled up like mountains below him. As Finch saw that it was almost time, he sneered and flew upward. He grabbed Zen and dragged him off the golden spider web. At that moment, Zen couldn't do anything but let Finch do what he wanted. He was also wrapped into a cocoon by so many golden spider silks, but even if he was free, he knew he still couldn't match up to Finch. Finch crossed to the other side carrying Zen in his arms. After walking a short distance, he smiled faintly and gestured with his hand, making the hexagonal seal float down with Lavender and trail behind them. You just need to endure it for a little while, and your suffering will end soon, Finch sneered. He pulled Zen over to a corner of the space and a bronze door appeared in front of him out of thin air. This door was a lot smaller than the one outside the Killing Sword Mountain, but it was almost an exact replica. I can easily deal with the door to the Killing Sword Mountain, but I can't open this door. I have already stayed here for too long. It's a good thing that you finally arrived. Ha ha. As soon as Finch finished speaking, he dragged Zen and forcefully threw him towards the bronze door. Zen found himself airborne. He was hurtled like a stone and thrown against the bronze door. His head slammed hard onto it and produced a loud bang. The bronze door was unbelievably tough and strong. Zen's head was considered to be a divine weapon, and yet the door wasn't even scratched after the collision. Finch wasn't contented yet. He took hold of Zen again and threw him back forcefully against the bronze door for the second time. Boom! After the second attempt, the bronze door remained tightly shut, without a hint of any reaction from it. Finch frowned. Did that thing fall asleep? As the thought crossed his mind, he grabbed Zen again and threw him hard towards the door for the third time. Boom! This time, the force that the blow generated was strong enough. Just the force from being thrown once by a world lord could even make Zen feel dizzy. The bronze door showed a response toward the stimulus. The sculpture of the thousand-legged spider began to move and descended quickly down the bronze door. Is this spider alive? Zen was dumbfounded. The bronze door outside the Killing Sword Mountain had a giant statue of a thousand-legged spider. Likewise, the bronze door in front of him also had a spider statue, but Zen did not notice it immediately. As he looked closely, Zen realized that the thousand-legged spider wasn't a statue after all, but a giant spider that was very much alive. Maybe this spider had been crawling on the door for many years already. If this spider had been able to prevent the entry of a world lord like Finch, Zen could easily imagine the strength that this spider held. In the past, Zen's thoughts were quite simple. He used to believe that after having broken through the Soul Sea Realm, the Spirit Supreme Realm, and the Spirit Transformation Realm, one could become a world lord. And a Supreme Lord was superior to a world lord. Now, it seemed that there were still many things in this universe that he needed to understand. Even the Cyan Dragon and Lavender did not tell him everything they knew. Zen doubted himself for a moment. Could there be another reason why he motivated himself so strongly to search for his sister? Zen smiled bitterly at himself, unsure whether he had a chance to unravel all these mysteries in the future. Buzz. The spider crawled slowly down from the bronze door and stretched out its thin legs one by one. The tips of those legs were as sharp as the edge of a blade. With a single flick of the spider's legs, the golden threads binding Zen were immediately broken. The moment he was released from his restraints, Zen had the impulse to leap into the air and escape. However, when he tried to do so, a frustrated expression was etched into his face. He realized he was actually unable to move. The giant spider used dozens of its legs to lift Zen up and carry him through the bronze door. Finch smiled faintly as he followed closely behind, the black leopard that he had summoned also following a few steps behind him. Lavender had no other choice but to accompany them through the bronze door too. The spider used innumerable legs to crawl on the ground while Zen was suspended in midair, under the spider's bloated belly. He noted the surroundings which they were passing through. In the cave beyond the bronze door, Zen finally saw the swords. The cavern was filled with a multitude of long swords, all of different types. There were fairy weapons, sacred weapons, and even divine weapons. Are these swords the ones that were stabbed into the mountain? Or could all of them be just an illusion? Zen looked around his surroundings curiously. Not long after, he was extremely shocked by what he saw. He saw Supreme Lord Sword, also known as Sword Chen. How could this be possible? He could not believe what he saw with his own eyes. Zen could not feel any aura of vitality coming from the person in front of him. His body was totally emaciated, and he might have passed away in this place after being trapped into the 5 aging processes. Even though a Supreme Lord had already passed away, they still radiated an aura that was difficult to approach. Zen had already seen for himself that Sword Chen had become a true god, so when he saw his mortal husk, he was confused for a moment. Finch also seemed to be very confused by what they were witnessing. Zen's whispering sword must have been entrusted to him by the old manor head. Therefore, when Zen told them that the old manor leader had transformed into a true god, Finch readily believed him. Now that he was suddenly faced with the old manor leader's corpse sitting in this place, he panicked immediately. Finch tried everything he could think of in order to open the bronze door, but he never managed to break through it. Never had it occurred to him that Supreme Lord Sword would have met his demise behind this door. Only the warrior who possessed the Whispering Sword could have gained the thousand-legged spider's consent and had been able to open the bronze door. Only Supreme Lord Sword could have entrusted the Whispering Sword to the warrior. However, it seemed that Supreme Lord Sword had died behind this very door. This formed a baffling paradox. If so, who had bestowed the Whispering Sword to Zen? Finch and Zen were both extremely perplexed, but at the same time, they could not help but also be extremely vigilant. Lavender sat a bit straighter within the hexagonal seal. She watched the scene unfold from a short distance away, and a faint smile slowly appeared on her face. The way she saw it, Finch's behavior was very ridiculous. Winning the first place of the competition in the illusion battlefield wasn't just for bragging rights. It also determined the future of the entire universe. Killing Zen wasn't really an easy task. He would possibly die in an imminent catastrophe, but it was impossible to kill him there. Lavender wasn't too surprised that they were facing this kind of accident. Chapter 1400, Corrosive Liquid. Finch didn't think of the corpse of a Supreme Lord as trouble. He was confused but also determined, given that he had planned this for so long. Finch was one of the earliest to have followed Supreme Lord Sword. No one knew where Supreme Lord Sword was from and how he had become a Supreme Lord. As an ordinary force, Sword Manor couldn't foster a Supreme Lord. But the reason behind a Supreme Lord showing up in the Sword Manor was really simple. The crowns of destiny had been monopolized by the great forces in the universe. Like the ogres, the thoughtless minds, the blessed Buddha land and the demon knight race. The difference in the strengths of a Supreme Lord and a World Lord was huge. Even if weak forces were to obtain a crown of destiny, they would have no time to manage to carry the heavenly destiny. The crown of destiny would, at most times, be expropriated by the great forces, with the weak forces having no power to resist. This meant that a force was no longer weak once a Supreme Lord appeared within it. The Sword Manor had become one of the great forces because Sword Chen had become a Supreme Lord. When an ogre Supreme Lord had died and the crown of destiny had disappeared, the entire universe was a possible place for the crown to reappear. The ogres had to try their best to find the new crown of destiny and bring it back. Almost all forces had joined in the battle for the crown of destiny, but Sword Chen had ended up inheriting it. Nobody yet knew what method Sword Chen had used to stop the great forces from fighting. Even the ogres had not attacked him, even though the ogre race had lost a crown of destiny for this one to appear. Finch could not figure out how Sword Chen could persuade the ogre and the other forces. Finch wasn't the only one that was confused. Some Supreme Lords who weren't participating in the fight were questioning this through the roaring tokens. But warriors from the great forces that had participated remained silent. Finch couldn't figure out the reason, but he was getting there with his own deductions. The reason was probably amazing and its value was definitely higher than that of a crown of destiny. But what in the universe would be more valuable than the crown of destiny? The crowns of destiny were the ultimate possessions in the universe. On the other hand, to become a Supreme Lord was to become one of the strongest 128 warriors of the universe. Finch, who had been just a steward of the Sword Manor at the time, had planted a seed of curiosity, which had now grown into a massive tree. He had to find the answers. It seemed like Supreme Lord Sword had had a premonition of his death before he had left. So he had arranged his heritage ahead of time and put it under the Killing Sword Mountain. Finch had already become the vice leader at the time and was Sword Chen's most important subordinate. As a consequence, he became the acting leader after Sword Chen had left and waited for the one with the whispering sword. It was only later that Supreme Lord Sword went missing and his disappearance became an eternal mystery. And ever since then, Finch had tried to open what Supreme Lord Sword had left behind. He passed the first gate easily, for Supreme Lord Sword had not encrypted it. It only took Finch a month to enter the Killing Sword Mountain. He had thought it would be easy all the way, but he was now stuck before the second gate. The thousand-legged spider had thwarted his attempts to break the gate it was guarding. It was the kind of spider that was from hell, and Finch had never been there. He had tried and failed to enter from around the gate because Supreme Lord Sword had used a brilliant technique to subtly fold the space around the gate. All he could have done was wait. And the day was finally here. He was confused and nervous when he saw Supreme Lord Sword's corpse here, but he was mostly excited because this meant that the mystery would finally be revealed. The thousand-legged spider threw Zen before Supreme Lord Sword before it scuttled away to hide. Zen stood up, an odd expression crossing his face. He had no idea what he should do and he was puzzled as he looked at Sword Chen's corpse. Zen took a step back, and suddenly, Sword Chen's corpse moved. Zen froze. He knew he had to be careful because even if a Supreme Lord was dead, one needed to be cautious around them. Zen could be killed instantly if Sword Chen had any tricks up his sleeve. Finch trembled too as he looked around warily. Sword Chen's corpse slowly raised its arm and pointed a gray finger at something behind Zen. The rocks behind Zen trembled and made way for a cyan pool, a dim light emanating off of it. Zen took a closer look and saw the hilt of a broken sword in the pool. The broken blade was shorter than 2 centimeters. It looked odd, like it wasn't broken by someone but melted instead. A faint light shone around the blade. It looked like the blade was still melting, but slowly. "What's this?" Zen asked, confused because he couldn't figure out why a broken sword had appeared here. Did it mean something? Something shifted in Finch's eyes and he aimed his sword at Zen as he ordered, "Fetch the broken sword." Finch was vigilant. He knew it wouldn't be that easy to get the broken sword since this place was so strange. Zen frowned. The water in the pool was clear, and seemed innocent enough. But the moment Zen touched the water, it hissed and sizzled, leaving half his finger blackened and in great pain. "My finger is corroded," Zen said, shocked. Finch's expression reflected Zen's as he said, "Corrosive liquid." "Zen, don't put your hand into the pool. This liquid can corrode anything and everything," Lavender said, frowning at the scene before her. No poison could affect Zen, but this corrosive liquid wasn't poisonous. It, however, was a strong corrosive force. As Finch aimed the sword at him, Zen pulled out a fairy weapon and thrust it into the pool, wanting to fish the broken sword out of the liquid. But the moment Zen put the weapon in, the blade began to disintegrate. It melted and disappeared the moment it was submerged in the corrosive liquid. The corrosive force of the liquid was far stronger than Zen had anticipated. I am not a patient person. Just grab it, Finch said coldly as he thrust the sword at Zen's shoulder, drawing blood. Zen couldn't help it now that he was facing Finch. But he was still hesitant as he looked at the corrosive liquid. Finch grunted angrily as he thrust his sword at Lavender without any warning. Her body of sword spirit was smashed into tiny red dots of light that slowly condensed into the shape of a girl again. It was the body of a sword spirit, but Zen could feel that Lavender was badly wounded. Finch's strike seemed to be powerful enough to hurt even a spirit. Zen gritted his teeth. He knew he didn't have a choice now. So he reached out into the pool. The moment Zen put his hands into the pool, the flesh and blood of his hands dissipated slowly, making it easy for everyone to see the process clearly. The corrosive liquid was really powerful. He could feel his hands burn, as if by a fire that couldn't be doused. Great pain spread along his hands. When Zen finally grabbed the broken sword, all that was left of his hands were bones. Whoosh! Zen grabbed the broken sword out of the pool. Whoosh! Finch flew towards Zen before he could react. Dozens of rays of the sword light hit the broken sword and shook off the corrosive liquid on it. Finch seized the broken sword and brandished it. Was it the heritage of Supreme Lord's sword? Finch was ecstatic. It doesn't belong to you. Give it to Zen, a strange voice echoed. The voice sounded old and came from the direction of the corpse. Finch had been nervous since they had found the corpse of Supreme Lord's sword. Hearing the voice was the last straw and Finch, startled and frightened, lashed out with the sword. The sword light rushed toward the corpse and began to fold like a piece of paper. Once it had folded several times over, the sword light disappeared. Finch was aware that only a few people in the universe could withstand his strike. No one apart from the Supreme Lords and Grand World Lords could do that. Finch was still in shock, but he decided to escape with the broken sword. He believed that this sword hid all of the secrets and that he would finally figure them out as long as he had the broken sword. He activated the sword step and rushed toward the gate. His sword step was much stronger than Zen's. But he froze in the air while he was just a few feet away. An invisible force was controlling him, rendering him motionless. Lavender looked at Finch, not surprised at the scene because she knew that someone would do it. But she hadn't expected the one to take action would be someone so powerful. It wasn't an ordinary Supreme Lord who had done so. Finch struggled, panicking, but he couldn't resist the force. Who's that? He screamed. Sword Chen had passed away a long time ago. He might have set some traps, but it was impossible for those traps to control Finch like this. A figure slowly emerged behind Sword Chen. The figure was in fancy robes, embroidered with special golden patterns. Finch thought the patterns were familiar and wondered where he had seen them before.